Every saint has a past. Every sinner has a future. Oscar fucking Wilde.
Not good.
She's stolen a car. One woman's opinion.
And that's true.
And yup.
Sociopathy as a spectrum disorder. So after she stabs somebody in the head,
I am concerned. Unclear.
which is very sad. I'm all over the place. This is ridiculous. It's hard to not have any sort of emotional reaction.
And then she's like, oh yeah, and I accidentally choked out a cat.
Is it intrinsic?
Do we all know right from wrong? Sociopath.
It's written by a woman named PATRIC GAGNE, and she is a self-proclaimed sociopath. She's also a therapist. She starts with an introduction, how she is essentially your everyday person, that you'd never be able to identify her as a sociopath because she's a member of a country club and a mom. She has an Instagram whose posts are borderline narcissistic. She goes on to say that she's a liar and she's a thief, and she hates your friends, and she has no access to empathy. She talks about the reason that she's writing this book, and she insinuates that anyone that picks up this book might also be wondering if they themselves are a sociopath. Currently, there is no set definition for what a sociopath is. There's sociopathic behavior. We talk about narcissism on a sociopathic spectrum, with sociopath sort of being the extreme end of the spectrum. Sociopath is a mysterious word. Its origin is based in century-old science, but it's since been misappropriated to cover all manner of sin. There's no singular definition for the term. Not anymore. She says the word, much like the people it represents, has become something of a paradox. Why does the word sociopath make people feel more than it makes them think? She says this is ironic. So she says she's written this book as a sort of guide, as a tool. She says that the events that take place in this book are true, but have probably been altered by, obviously, her perspective, and that the dialogue has changed, and so take her with a grain of salt. She says that we all probably know a sociopath, but it's probably not who we think it is. Because in order to survive in society and participate in society, ultimately she's had to mask and perform empathy to establish relationships. She says, think you know a sociopath? I'll bet you're right. But I'll also bet it's the last person you suspect. Contrary to popular belief, sociopaths are more than their personality markers. They are children seeking understanding. They are patients hoping for validation. They are parents looking for answers. They are human beings in need of compassion. So now we get into the actual story of the thing. The first chapter is called Honest Girl. This is where she talks about her relationship with honesty. She describes a relationship with her mom, wherein she sort of uses her mom as an emotional barometer. She says that in her early life, she felt a lot of nothingness. And the only way to make the nothingness go away was to do something that she knew was bad. She says, I suffered from a different type of urge, a compulsion brought about by a discomfort of apathy, the nearly indescribable absence of common social emotions like shame and empathy. But she didn't understand this at the time. All she could feel was this urge. She says it would start with an impulse to make the nothingness stop. It was claustrophobic, like being trapped inside my brain, trapped inside a void. She says her reactions to this apathy start out as trivial. She describes stealing a barrette, lying at various points in time, breaking into people's homes, not hurting anybody or doing anything, but really just a blatant disregard for the rules. A lack of understanding around morals and why other people subscribe to them. She says she can't really feel empathy for other people. She can't understand what it would be like to have someone break into her home. She can't put herself in other people's shoes. She didn't fear consequences, and she didn't suffer from remorse. Two more things that she already at a very young age had figured out were quite normal. She says that by the time she's 7 years old, her peers understand that there's something different about her. They start describing her as weird. They seem a little bit afraid of her. It was a very specific look, equal parts confusion, certainty, and fear. By page 11 of the book, she's describing interactions with neighbor kids, one of which who she clearly describes as cruel. She says that the Goodman neighbors were always in trouble, usually because of something that the elder sister had done, and PATRIC finds their behavior infuriating. She recognizes that she's in no position to judge, but at the time she feels she can justify her revulsion. From her perspective, it all comes down to intent. Remember, she's told us that she can't understand the intentions of other people. She's told us that she cannot understand what it is to be in other shoes. And yet, she says, quote, "Whereas my actions might have sometimes been questionable, I wasn't breaking rules because I enjoyed it. I acted out because I felt I had no choice. It was a means of self-preservation, of keeping worse things from happening." The Goodmans' actions, on the other hand, were reckless, attention-seeking, and mean. The bad things they like to do serve no purpose other than cruelty for cruelty's sake, but she gets to assume the intentions of others while justifying her own. Patrick says that the way that she formulated a relationship with her family members, the closest, genuine bond that she had with another was with her mom. She describes her mom, she says she was my emotional compass and I trusted her to guide me. With Mom on my side, I didn't have to worry about feeling or not feeling, or choosing right from wrong. But when she was angry, I felt like I was on my own. And back then, on my own wasn't a safe place to be. In some part, Patrick is describing enmeshment with her mom. If her mom is her emotional compass, if in lieu of developing her own emotions, Mom was sort of the center of Patrick's life, that might explain the depth of this emotional immaturity that borders on sociopathic thinking, behavior. We're not sure yet. I'm only 7% into the book. Something else to note is that Patrick is very clear with us that she comes from a position of privilege and that both of her parents come from privilege as well. The book is set in San Francisco. Her dad, a wealthy music executive. She says that there's a picture of her as a child taking the glasses, stealing the glasses off Ringo Starr's face. She still has the glasses of a Beatle, which is objectively cool as fuck, but maybe also gives us a little bit of reason as to why she can't put herself in anyone else's shoes. She's born into extreme privilege. Patrick says that by the time her sister Harlow is born, her dad's spending less and less time at home, mostly just to sleep. He's coming home after midnight pretty much every day. And after a while, my mother became depressed. Some days she'd burst into tears over the tiniest thing. Other times she'd be angry and snap at us for reasons I didn't understand. I was anxious and confused and for the first time unable to rely on my mother for guidance. It had been weeks since she'd made one of her cakes, and no time seemed good to talk to her about the stuff I'd been doing, like stealing. She no longer has her mother as an emotional compass. Patrick says that at this point in time, her head was hurting. The pressure had been steadily increasing, yet nothing I did seemed to help. I was emotionally disconnected, but also stressed and somewhat disoriented. It was like I was losing my mind, and I just wanted to be alone. She says around this time, the second grade, she stabs somebody in the head. Sid started screaming, and the other kids understandably lost it. Meanwhile, I was in a daze. The pressure was gone, but unlike every other time I'd done something bad, my physical attack on Sid had resulted in something different, a sort of euphoria. This is the first time Patrick participates in violence, and it results in her feeling bliss. It was like I'd discovered a fast track to tranquility, one that was equal parts efficacy and madness. What's interesting about this, right, what we know about narcissism is that ultimately narcissism is just an inability to believe in the reality of others, which is why you don't care what they're thinking or feeling, because you don't really think they're real. And narcissism is, again, mostly an extreme emotional immaturity, because to believe in other people's realities is quite complex, and you can't really love when you're emotionally immature, because your emphasis is survival. It's yourself. Your entire perspective is coming from you. And so when she stabs this girl in the head, and she doesn't care that she stabbed this girl in the head, and she's just detailing this, her parents saying that, you're not really sorry, not in your heart. There's something off about you. I can't quite put my finger on it, but I can feel it. What's interesting about this is that white people, people of privilege, have always historically decided who qualifies as human and who doesn't, whose reality we're going to value and who doesn't, who we're going to recognize as perceiving us and who doesn't. And knowing that both of her parents come from the South, come from privilege. What's off about Patrick is probably also off about them, just not as completely. After her mom looks at her with what sounds like shame, she says, "My stomach lurched as though I'd been punched. I hated the way my mother stared at me that night. She'd never done it before, and I wanted her to stop. Seeing her look at me that way was like being observed by someone who didn't know me at all. Suddenly, I was furious with myself for telling the truth. It hadn't helped anyone understand. If anything, it had made me and everyone more confused. Anxious to make things right, I stood up and tried to hug her, but she lifted her hand to stop me. No, she said, no. Then, because of the way that her parents have shamed her, because she doesn't feel remorse. And again, she's a young child, right? Like, we know that a lot of children don't necessarily have access to empathy because it's a complex emotion that requires a certain amount of maturation and experience, right? And interaction with other people and compassion. A lot of the times we have to be shown compassion in order to show compassion. It must be modeled for us. The first 6% of this book is Patrick telling us that her mom has modeled compassion, but she hasn't. Not really. Her mom has told her that she should have compassion, that honesty is important, that there are rules that you don't break. But we haven't been shown her demonstrating anything like that. She says that after her parents shame her and leave her be, she recognizes that she needs to exert some sort of violence to access the bliss she did when she stabbed this girl in the head. And so she perpetuates violence against herself. She says, I squeezed a pillow to my chest, digging my nails into my forearm. Be sorry, I hissed. I continued to claw at my skin and clench my jaw, willing remorse with all my might. Can't remember how long I tried, only that I was desperate and furious once I finally gave up. Which is very sad, because this is a young child blaming herself for something that isn't her fault. Most of us are products of our environments. Patrick is a product of where she was raised, which is in white, rich California. Then, after this incident with this girl, it says her mom withdrew from everyone. For weeks, she hardly came out of her room, and when she did, she always seemed sad. Nanny Lee was mostly in charge then. I loved Nanny Lee. She was kind and gentle, and she always read books to us after we should have been asleep. But what I really needed was my mother. And that's true. So she became confused, right? It's disconcerting to have felt euphoria after hurting somebody, and it's as disconcerting as it is tempting, because of course she wants, what she's describing is relief. She wanted to hurt again, only she didn't want to. I wasn't sure how things had gone so wrong, I just knew it was my fault, and I had to find a way to make it better. Oh my God. We also learned that her uncle Gilbert is the chief guard at a prison. We are products of our environment. Is not Patrick just, the physical manifestation of, sort of, for lack of a better word, the sins of her forefathers? I don't know. Okay, so this is when Patrick in Florida at this prison comes across the word sociopath. She's asking her uncle why these men are in prison. And he says, here's the thing. These guys have all done some messed up stuff. But it isn't just what they did. It's that they aren't sorry about it. They weren't scared to do it to begin with. That's why they're in here. Oh, I said, though I still didn't get it. The men in this prison, Bobby added, I'd say 80% are sociopaths. It was the first time I'd heard the word. Oh, I said again, what's a sociopath? Somebody who doesn't feel bad about what they do, Bobby said. No shame, doesn't scare easy, never feels guilty, someone who isn't afraid of getting caught and does the same stupid stuff over and over. She learns here that sociopaths aren't afraid of consequences. Oh my God. So after she stabs somebody in the head, her mom says, pack a bag. We're going to visit Grandma for the weekend. This is how my mother informed us she was leaving my father and moving us to Florida. Not knowing any better, I packed for the weekend. Again, not a judgment of her mother's parenting in any way, shape, or form. Just an explanation as to why she might not be the most emotionally adjusted person in the world. An explanation as to why she might be the least emotionally adjusted person in the world. Okay, things in Florida were weird from the start. For one thing, my mother refused to admit that she'd left my father and that we were now permanent residents of the Sunshine State. This remained the case even after Dad shipped the car, along with the rest of her things, so she could start looking for a new house. Mom, I realized, didn't always tell the truth, and it was frustrating. Patrick tells us that at this point in time, she acquires her first pet, a ferret named Baby. I adored Baby. If she tells me she hurt this animal, I'm gonna be pissed. She says, I loved it in that house. Whenever I stepped inside, I was instantly at ease. The blankness of the space matched the way I felt, and I liked the equilibrium. She's broken into this vacant house. I also liked that, although it was empty, the house seemed full. I'd sit for hours alone in the frenetic stillness. A lack of feeling, which normally stressed me out, had the opposite effect in the vacant house. In a weird way, it reminded me of the Gravitron. The perennial country fair favorite is a spinning ride that offers no seatbelts or even seats. Riders are pinned to the wall through centrifugal force. It's centrifugal motions. All around me, the house was pulsing, aghast at having been violated. Yet I was calm in its center, at peace and in control. She says there was never a good time to talk to Mom in Florida. Lately, it seemed like she really wanted to avoid me. She refused to discuss anything, even remotely uncomfortable. And I mean obvious things, like the fact that we are absolutely, positively, not living with Dad in San Francisco, and we're apparently never going back. Her mom is insisting that the reality of the situation isn't what it is. Her mom is denying and rejecting reality, which is that her parents are now divorced, that they now live in a completely different state on the opposite side of the continental U.S., and that they're going to stay there for a long time. Occasionally, I tried to fit in, to act normal, like the other kids around me. But I was like a blonde, ferret-toting Wednesday Addams, leisurely repelling everyone in my path. For one thing, my exposure to conventional behavior and reactions was limited to my immediate family, so I could only fake it for so long. But more importantly, I didn't have anyone who could teach me. She doesn't have anyone to model appropriate behavior for her. So is she a sociopath, or is she just underdeveloped? Is she capable of development? Sounds like probably. Sounds like maybe. Some feelings came naturally to me, like anger and happiness. But other emotions weren't so easy. Empathy and guilt, embarrassment and jealousy were like a language I couldn't speak or understand. She thinks she has a feeling disability. Patrick uses an example with a 5th grade teacher, Mrs. Ravenel, who's the meanest teacher in the school, so much so that misbehaving students are sent to her instead of to any sort of principal for disciplinary action. She says that this teacher threatens children with, like, extreme force, really cruel punishments. She says that she could recognize that this teacher was hurting a kid using emotion. Worse, she was enjoying it. Patrick recognizes something in this teacher that she doesn't see in herself. It's better to be like me, I thought. It was the first time that I realized that fear couldn't be used against me. It wasn't that I was immune to it, per se, just that mine was muted. I understood this wasn't the case for most kids. While my classmates lived in constant terror of Mrs. Ravenel, I was never intimidated by her antics. When my cousins were afraid to leave the house after dark, I had no problem wandering around my neighborhood alone. And while my sister was quietly playing in our room after school, I was breaking into nearby homes. Could I have gotten caught? Sure. Was I worried about the consequences? No. I had decided fear must be a useless emotion. I pitied people who seemed to be afraid of everything. Is this about development, or is it about the fact that Patrick has never faced consequences up until this point? Patrick herself stabbed a 2nd grader in the head and didn't face any sort of consequences. And while she's saying she knows she could get caught for breaking into houses, again, she's broken into houses and she's confided in her mom about breaking into houses, and nothing has happened. There have been no consequences. Is it that Patrick's not afraid of consequences? Or is it that she's immune to them because of her privilege? Her privilege protects her. Like, is it that Patrick can't feel fear? Or is it that she doesn't live in reality? She lives in the reality of a privileged white girl with next to no parental supervision. Was weird. Chapter 4. It's called Alert. This is when the pet ferret dies. Baby dies. Her mom comes into the room and lets her know. The news of Baby's death was a shock that wouldn't settle. It was just rattling around in my head. I blinked a few times, then nodded to my mother and continued watching television. After a heavy sigh, to convey that my non-reaction was unacceptable, she headed upstairs to comfort Harlow. And for the first time I could recall, I was jealous. This is the first time she's experiencing something as complex as jealousy. She feels jealous of her sister Harlow because she's upstairs being comforted by her mother, which if we remember, is a relationship that the two of them used to have. They don't anymore, because her mother has shamed and rejected her for not being right, for not feeling what she's supposed to feel. So she's aware that her non-reaction is unacceptable. And then she goes to the mirror. She reports going to the mirror and trying to get herself to cry, performing sadness. She says, "To say I felt nothing isn't true. I loved baby more than almost anything else in the world. That she was now dead was inconceivable to me, and yet here we are, and here she wasn't." It's the rejection of the reality that is staving off the emotion. Patrick says, "I could tell that my mother didn't know what to do with a kid like me. Like any decent parent, she expected a normal kid with normal reactions." Again, Patrick's being really fair to her mom. We're not here to judge her mom. But to say that her mom is a decent parent might be a bit of an overstatement. It's very do as I say, not as I do. You know what I mean? That I wasn't able to give her what she wanted put me into a state it started to refer to as stuck stress. This is quite disconcerting. It means that her relationship with her mother is now the primary source for her anxiety. And as we get further and further into this book, it's looking like maybe it's not that Patrick, doesn't have these other emotions, that her body wouldn't be capable of more complex emotions like love and grief, bereavement. More so that the anxiety that she feels because of the insecure attachment she has to her mother, to her life, to her family, makes it impossible for her to feel anything else. She says this next. "It was the claustrophobia that arose any time I became aware I wasn't feeling what others expected me to be feeling. Her mother's rejection of her leads to her belief that she's going to be rejected by society in total." She says, "It wasn't so much that I was lacking the feeling as it was that I was separated from it, like my reflection in the door. I could see my emotions, but I wasn't connected to them." Patrick starts talking about how she's on pretty thin ice with her mom. It says it starts when she'd gone to a sleepover and ended up wanting to walk home. The reason that Patrick keeps walking home from sleepovers is because when everyone else falls asleep and she's confronted with silence, she believes she can't stop herself from doing bad things, wrong things. Up until this point, the only violence we've seen Patrick perpetuate is obviously stabbing that girl in the head, which is a huge deal. And is it about the violence or is it about the expression of emotion, right? Is it about the extreme emotional dysregulation, the disproportionate emotional response that she needs to exercise in some way? Doesn't mean that she doesn't have other emotions. It maybe just means her fear is too big to confront. Just a thought. So she thinks she can't stop herself, so she gets really in her head about the prisoners she's met and about how her Uncle Gilbert has told her that the people in prison, the men in these prisons, are sociopaths because they could not stop themselves from doing bad things. Again, bad things is super vague and undefined, and we haven't really seen Patrick do anything other than break rules that she can't understand, like going into her neighbor's house to take a cup of sugar even though her neighbors aren't home. If her neighbors were home, she knows that they would give her the cup of sugar. Patrick actually thinks she's doing her neighbors a favor, saving them the small talk, the performative small talk, which she's correct about in assessing, right? So anyway, she walks home in the middle of the night from a sleepover. Mom said, almost screaming, "Why are you here?" It's in all caps. I tried to explain, but the scene quickly devolved into chaos on her part and confusion on mine. But Mom ended up dropping her wine glass on the floor and racing upstairs to her room, sobbing. This is a disproportionate reaction, right, to the stimuli. It's very confusing to Patrick, and it's honestly a little bit confusing to me. This sounds like a mom who's not regulated. Patrick overhears her mom sobbing with this boyfriend, saying, "I don't know what to do with her," saying between gasps, "I just don't know what to do." I stood in the dark, searching for the right word to describe what I was feeling until it suddenly appeared. Alert. It wasn't fear, it was vigilance. I was keenly and eerily alert. Hypervigilance is a response that humans have to traumatic environments. Consistently traumatic environments. And that makes sense because humans are prey animals. So if Patrick ends up in a state of alert and this is the only thing she can feel, it implies something about her household more than it implies something about herself. She says, "If Mom thought I was being dishonest, even if I wasn't, I lost her as my compass. When she'd called me her honest girl, I'd know I was safe." So she says she resolves herself to never be dishonest. From that day forward, I went to extremes, refusing to be dishonest about anything. I even started counting the number of bites I consumed at dinner time just in case Mom wanted to know how much I'd eaten. I worked so hard to be perfect. This is very fucking sad, obviously. My reaction to baby's death was an honest one, so why was I standing in my bedroom alone and in trouble once again? Patrick asked her mom why she didn't pick her up from school, and her mom shook her head, transferring the tomato to a bowl. We buried the ferret, actually. I froze. Cold rage rose from the ground and into my stomach. Mom set down the knife and turned around. Well, you didn't seem like you cared much last night, she said, sounding almost smug, so I didn't think you'd mind. That's passive-aggressive as hell, and so inappropriate. Unable to contain my fury because she's come home from school and found out that her sister and her mom have had a funeral service, so to speak, for her pet in an effort to punish her, not expressing grief the way her mom believes grief should be expressed. Unable to contain my fury, I grabbed the nearest object, a glass pitcher, and threw it as hard as I could at the wall behind her head. Keep in mind, this is not Patrick saying that she's throwing it at her mom's head. She's not trying to hurt her mom. She's not trying to express violence. What she feels is rage, and we know that she doesn't initially feel rage. What she feels is betrayal. What she feels is rejection. What she feels is shame. What she feels is grief. And the only thing she's actually capable of comprehending, because her development has been stunted by her fuck-ass parents, is anger. So she throws a pitcher at the wall behind her mom's head and it explodes. Patrick says she recognizes at this age that her mom did this to punish her. She confronts her mom about it. And her mom says, "I thought it would teach you a lesson." Which is, again, terrifying. This is not how parents are meant to teach lessons. This is not guidance. Then her mom, barely able to breathe, says, "You are a nightmare." Blood pumped fiercely through my veins as I walked down the hall. It galvanized me. I had loved the confrontation. The rest of my family avoided conflict, but not me. I found it exciting, even delectable. It made me feel powerful. This confrontation, this admission that she loves conflict, is, again, perhaps not that surprising. We know that her mom has avoided hard truths, avoided things that she doesn't feel like dealing with. Patrick feeling empowered enough to call out the truth or the reality of the situation, of course it makes her feel powerful. With my mother already irate, I didn't have to worry about right actions or wrong ones. I didn't have to worry about the stress that came with trying to play normal. Alone in my room, I didn't have to offer fake reactions to display feelings I didn't have. I was free from emotion, from expectation, from pressure, from everything. Several hours later, she hears her mom crying in her room, talking on the phone with someone. And her mom says she doesn't seem to care about anything. And I'm wondering if that's a normal reaction. This is a kid that's had no control in her life. And not just like an inability to fully express autonomy in the way that kids might otherwise have. She initially has interest in her peers. She just drops it because her peers seem to think there's something wrong with her. She's not reacting normally. And then, of course, her mom, her family, pulls her out of school. She spends her days hanging around in vacant houses with a ferret. Like, it's normal that she's not normal. Of course that's the way things are. When she says she doesn't seem to care about anything, she cares about her mom. She only cares about her mom. This is where things get a little bit more interesting. Patrick casually mentions that she locks some girls in the bathroom at school. She doesn't lock them in the bathroom to hurt them. She doesn't lock them in the bathroom to scare them. She doesn't lock them in the bathroom so that she can witness their emotional reaction. After she locks them in the bathroom, she says it was a freedom unlike any other. In an instant, all the pressure was gone. In its place, I felt calm. I felt high. She says the girls start to bang on the door and they start screaming, and she's listening with a detached interest. She's not excited by the fact that they're hurt. Right? She's not a psychopath. She's, I don't know. Then she rationalizes her decision. I wasn't thinking. And the danger in allowing the pressure to rise for so long became apparent. She got sloppy. She gets caught, obviously, locking the girls in the bathroom. And that's what had made her dangerous. So she resolves herself to be really smart about the way she goes about breaking rules. I want you to remember that the rules that Patrick has previously been breaking, they seem to be about, an inability to comprehend respect and boundaries. And we know that her mom and her don't have any boundaries. and we know that her dad does not respect her or her mom. Patrick says she arrives at the conclusion that inflicting pain or distress was a guaranteed, instantaneous method of pressure elimination, and she doesn't know why. It wasn't just that I didn't care. It was that I didn't care that I didn't care. It's a release from expectation. It's a release from the rejection of self. Succumbing to my darkest compulsions was effortless and required no energy. And God, I love that release. Felt like surrender. In overhearing this conversation with someone else, her mom says she might have to send her to boarding school, which is obviously not to get her the help that her mom believes she needs, right? It's just to get her out of the house. It's because her mom becomes afraid of her. Patrick says, I was leery of a world without her guidance, even if I was reluctantly starting to grasp that her guidance was just an illusion. Yup. It would never adequately apply to a person like me, and it feels like Patrick's ability to, like, her framework for self as like a proper noun, capital S, feels retroactive. She says she recognizes that her mom's incapable of understanding. Despite mom's insistence to always want the truth, she couldn't accept the truth. And deep down, I knew it was unfair to keep putting her in that position. So this is an immediate switch, right? Like, maybe Patrick has always been parentified, but for sure she is right now. She feels bad. She feels some sort of remorse. She says that her mom didn't know any better, burying the ferret, and that it wasn't fair to her to punish her for punishing Patrick. Sorry, maybe that's confusing. Patrick is taking on a more responsible approach to her relationship with her mother than her mother is with her. That's a problem. She says mom was never going to understand or accept who I was. And maybe that's always would have been true, no matter who Patrick ended up being. Mom might have convinced herself she was only trying to help, but what she had done was downright mean, not to mention premeditated. So here's another example of Patrick assuming the intentions of someone else and understanding them. And then she says, considering what mom had done with baby, maybe she deserved to lose those earrings after all. This seems to be her demonstrating a God complex, a power issue. But we also know that her mom has just modeled this behavior for her, right? Hey, you didn't cry when I told you the ferret died, so now you deserve not to be able to, bury it. When we reach chapter 5, Patrick says, like my limited grasp of emotion, the concept of boundaries was muddled for me. What's more, it solidified my understanding that I was very different from other people my age. Most kids seem to inherently get the idea of limits. They understood when to stop and when to go. They had an emotional connection to right versus wrong, but that was never the case with me, particularly when it came to rules that I felt were open to interpretation, like stealing and lying and breaking into our old house so I could get something I need. Is it intrinsic? Do we all know right from wrong? Do we see compassion modeled and then decide to model it ourselves? Do we fear consequences because we care about our well-being? Patrick clearly cares about her own well-being. Is it crazy if I say that it sounds like maybe Patrick's autistic? Like, I'm not excusing the behavior, obviously, right? Like, obviously I'm not excusing the behavior. I'm just saying it makes sense. And if you believe your whole life that you're a sociopath, maybe you will be. We tend to meet expectations. I was starting to understand why doing bad things made me feel something. However brief, it connected me to the way I imagined everyone else felt all the time. Lurking beneath my surface, I always had an urge to prowl or steal or stalk, sometimes even to hurt. This wasn't because I wanted to, but because some part of me understood that it made me feel better. It made me feel, period. My moderated bad behavior was a form of self-preservation, a clunky attempt to keep myself from doing something really bad. Most of the time, such behavior had occurred at random, because I was always trying to maintain that tether to my mother. I'd always been careful never to engage with it unless I had to. But now things were different. Without the burden of needing to be good for my mom, the idea of freedom was exciting. So this does sort of confirm our theory about Patrick lacking a sense of self. The only reason she was behaving or following rules that she didn't necessarily understand was in order to, earn her mom's approval. without her mom, she has no principles, no values, nothing to guide her behavior forward. Does her mom have principles and values? I don't know. Alone and with nothing and no one to stop me, I was aware my dark side might take things too far. But what if, instead of working so hard to try to beat my dark side, I opted for a treaty? This is the thing, like, we all have dark sides. Maybe I'm exposing too much about myself. Never wanted to hurt anyone. Haven't had violent urges. But I have been angry enough that I've wanted to punch a wall. Sometimes we act out aggressively. Everyone has a dark side. It's her mom's belief that the fact that Patrick's dark side exists, which, Patrick would not have labeled the things that she did as dark. What it looks like is curiosity. What it looks like is an undauntedness, a dauntlessness. My mind drifted to my grandfather's farm in Mississippi and the wild horses there that he would train to be ridden. They're mad at first, Granddaddy once explained. They kick, they buck, they try to throw you off, but if you're consistent, you can gain their trust. You introduce pressure so they learn to release their will. And most importantly, you reward their progress to encourage obedience. And that is how you break a horse. I recognize that this is normal practice, but is this moral? Is it moral? It's this example that leads Patrick to decide that she's going to tame herself. Another thing that seems to be going on in this book is it seems like Patrick is using her cleverness to, as evidence. So she follows a man who's walking his dog down the street, and she's looking in his window. She's watching how other people exist. And I think that's kind of normal too, right? Taylor Swift. I look in people's windows. Right? Peeping Tom. It's a thing. Are Peeping Tom sociopaths? I don't know. Especially given her unorthodox upbringing, maybe it makes sense that she, as a child, right, is interested in watching other people conduct their lives. Anyway, she gets caught kind of peeping, and she comes up with something to say. She performs something else. Shh, I whispered playfully. We're playing hide and seek. Then I shot him a wicked smile and took off running. She's clever. She's quick. Okay, and this is when Patrick realizes. In bed that night, I was pleased with myself. I had allowed my dark side to have some fun, but I had maintained control the whole time. I imposed boundaries. My boundaries. My dark and light sides were no longer conflicting but coexisting, and yet I still had some things to figure out. Breaking into our old townhouse and following strangers after bedtime weren't the right things to do. This I knew for sure, but who got to decide? Who was it hurting? I wondered. If discipline and boundaries were things that kept my dark side in check, then it would seem that outright harmful actions were the only ones that were truly bad. Everything else, I said to myself, is fair game. And is this not the billionaire's playbook? Minus the who is it hurting? Okay, so she makes rules for herself. Patrick's rules. Number 1, no hurting anybody. Woo! The fact that she cares about that means something. But now that I was older and without the tether of my mother's conscience, I could experiment with other methods. Does Patrick not develop her own conscience because she's deferring to her mother's? Does that mean she doesn't have the capacity for conscience? I don't think so. I look in people's windows like I'm some deranged weirdo. Like, children bully each other. Does that mean that children that are bullies are sociopaths? You tell me, Patrick. I didn't crave attention or acknowledgement. I merely wanted to achieve my objective, to live life on my terms. Is that so insane? Is it insane? Is it insane? So, once Patrick gets to junior high, she talks about skipping school. She says that my junior high was a notorious cesspool. Fights, sex, drugs, you name it. The place was terrible, and everyone knew it. So why is it bad that I leave? I wondered. I chose to remove myself from a shitty environment, and I wasn't hurting anyone in the process. Obviously, she is hurting people in the process because what she's doing is breaking into vacant homes and hanging out there, but the logic behind it is not flawed. The real concern is that she does not adhere to, or she doesn't have any sort of respect for the rules, and she says this is because she can't feel fear. Let's get serious. Let me readjust for the seriousness. She turns 14 and she meets a boy. We're about to find out if she's capable of romantic love. She's been enrolled in a creative arts program. because she doesn't want to go to church camp. She likes it. The program was held in what had been one of oil magnate John D. Rockefeller's winter homes. So Patrick meets a boy. He's a senior. She's 14. He's 18. He has a fake ID, he smokes cigarettes, drives his own car that he bought with his own money, and like her, he's quick to break the rules if he thinks they don't make sense. But beneath his rebellious surface, he was a straight-A student, a kind and thoughtful soul unlike anyone I'd ever met, whereas I was objective and cool. David was emotional and passionate. My feelings for David, albeit strong, were hard for me to understand at first. Although I was pleasantly surprised that my emotions were neither incestuous nor tumultuous, I also found them difficult to fully internalize. My emotional constitution, it seemed, was a lot like a cheap set of crayons. I had access to primary colors, joy and sadness, but more nuanced hues, complex feelings like romantic love and passion had always been outside of my reach. That's normal for 13-year-olds. I knew such things existed because I'd read about them in books and seen examples on TV, but I'd never been able to relate to them. In school, we'd read Wuthering Heights. Yikes! 14 years old, Wuthering Heights. The girls in class swooned over Heathcliff and professed a deep connection to Catherine Earnshaw, the female protagonist. Yeah. To them, the book was a compelling star-crossed lover's tragedy, but I didn't get it. Do you think the end of this book is Patrick telling us she's autistic? The night I finished, I breathed a sigh of relief and tossed the book behind the couch, making a face at my mother. You didn't like it? She asked. Why not? Because Kathy's an idiot, I replied. She's a Heather, I said, referring to the classic 80s film. She acts all unruly and wild, but it's clearly for show because all she really wants is status and some boring husband. Meanwhile, she's fainting and crying over Heathcliff. She doesn't even understand Heathcliff. I rolled my eyes. He's no prize either, by the way. I shook my head and said, I can't believe that book is supposed to be the be-all, end-all of love stories. My feelings for David weren't obsessive or possessive. They were effortless. I wasn't out of control or delirious like Kathy was for Heathcliff. He didn't sweep me off my feet either. My feet were very much rooted in place. Maybe for the first time in my life. But the best part was that I had a really cool person whose feet were planted right next to mine. The coolest person in the world, as far as I was concerned. Sounds like she literally just has a relationship with someone, like a human connection. Romantically speaking, David didn't just represent everything I wanted to have, he represented everything I wanted to be. He had the ability to access and express a full range of feeling, but never made me feel bad that I didn't. Being with David made me feel whole. His acceptance made me feel safe. Patrick's describing the pressure she feels to David. It feels like a full pot of water on a hot stove. By the time it's simmering, I start to get really antsy because I know I have to do something to keep it from boiling over. What happens if the water boils over? David asks. I get violent. Patrick believes she's a human that does not need to be loved, not in the way that everyone else does. And is that because she isn't? Is that because she's a child that has not been loved? Obviously, her basic needs have been met, but her psychological needs have not been. It's literally been impossible for her to self-actualize and fully individuate. Let's just look at Maslow's hierarchy for a second. My entire life, I'd always tried to conceal the type of person I truly was, not to investigate it or understand it, but to hide it, deny it, eliminate it. Elimination of self. Elimination of what she believes is intrinsic to her. Elimination of what she thinks is like a fundamental way of being. She believes she is fundamentally wrong, which doesn't sound dissimilar to the undiagnosed neurodivergent experience. Not suggesting that undiagnosed neurodivergent people often have a penchant for violence or anything like that, but I showed David who I really was, and he didn't want to change me. He accepted me. David, unlike anyone else I'd ever met, actually seemed to see me. Better yet, he liked what he saw. That, too, was a new experience. Rejection by parents fucks us up. Though I'd never particularly disliked myself, it had never occurred to me to formulate an opinion. I'd come to accept the attributes separating me from everyone else were not deserving of praise, but now I started to rethink that. As our weeks at camp progressed, I found myself coming around to the idea that despite my differences, I could be a valued person, a good person. After all, David seemed to think so. This implies that if her mom had not been a dick, maybe this book wouldn't exist, and maybe I could be reading something else. It's a bummer that he's an 18-year-old man and she's a 14-year-old girl, but I'm glad that she's experiencing acceptance. She thinks he's the yang to my yin, which is her looking for someone to complete her, giving us more evidence that she's not complete inside of herself. All right, and then the 18-year-old man kisses the 14-year-old girl. Caught by surprise, I took in a quick breath, which amplified the flavor. He tasted like smoky dark chocolate with a hint of tobacco, because he smokes cigarettes because he's an adult man.
I'm wearing my empathy shirt for the Sociopath book. Do you get it? David sort of implying that maybe she's a little weird. Maybe she's a little bit more intense than other people that he has known. And she says, okay, I can do something about that. Let me try to contort to your idea, to your expectations of what a human should be. As soon as the words left my mouth, I got annoyed. It was the same reaction I'd have as a child when I thought I needed my mother's guidance to keep me in line. Back when I'd have done anything to keep the tether in place, even if it meant pretending to be something I wasn't. What's really important, and this is not an original quote by me, is that we remember that performance is the antithesis to belonging. So as long as you are performing, as long as you are contorting, as long as you are pretending, regardless of the social feedback you get, even if it's overwhelmingly positive, you will never feel a sense of belonging. You will never feel a sense of acceptance. That's why it's really important to be authentic. Sounds like Patrick knows this. She says, I shudder just thinking about it. For the first time in my life, I liked being me, and not just on my own, but around somebody else. I didn't want to change, and I didn't want to have to pretend. Fortunately, David seemed to agree. Patrick mentions reading an article about OCD and how she feels like she's not in control of her impulses, how she feels compelled to act on either the violence or the bad behavior that she has in the past. She says the article said that OCD is a disorder over which the afflicted have very little control, and she can relate. Even though she can theoretically prevent herself from doing bad things, she wasn't able to hold out for long. She says she usually loses that battle. This is kind of an interesting way to order the book, because we get a lot of like, oh, cool, Patrick, this is normal. And then she's like, oh yeah, and I accidentally choked out a cat. This next part's kind of upsetting, so I'm not going to quote it. She's mentioning visiting her grandmother and, not having anything to do, not having any adult supervision, being a very young child, and grabbing a cat. Eventually, she releases it of her own volition, but she recognizes that it wasn't good. She has this rule, right? The only rule in her life, which is, again, a problem. Children need rules in order to feel balanced and okay. They recognize that they shouldn't be in charge of themselves. So she knows that not hurting anybody also includes animals, it includes creatures, it includes cats. She thinks that hurting this cat could act as sort of a gateway drug for violence. I am concerned. She wonders if she should confide in David about the cat. Just as she's about to, he says, I love you. So this is love. Previously, Patrick's only ever been able to think about love as a transaction, and that makes sense, right? Because she said that her closest relationships, the only relationships she's seen modeled is her parents, and it has become transactional over time if it didn't start that way. The other adult that she's close to is her nanny, who is paid to care for her. Not to say that her nanny doesn't love her, but it makes sense that Patrick understands this as a transaction, temporary transaction. So she says that love with David didn't feel transactional or conditional or dangerous or useless. This feeling was perfectly symbiotic, in that I was simultaneously experiencing what it was like to care about someone not related to me, and, by the grace of that connection, what it was like to care about myself for the very first time. Understanding, acceptance, safety, and honesty. I had long yearned for these things, and now I had them. Keep in mind that these are things that children need to develop healthy psychology. Understanding, acceptance, safety, and honesty. Consistency, security, love. Doesn't sound like a high bar, but most of us know that it is. She says that David, without even knowing it, taught her how to adapt to things like communication and affection. Concepts she imagines come easily to most people, but not to me. This is Patrick sort of showing us the way that narcissism obviously can become sociopathic, but also why it's so hard to treat, right? Like, growth as a human comes from inside, Nobody can tell me, right? You have to find out for yourself. No matter how many Disney movies you watch, no matter books you read, no matter teachers try to sit down and tell you how you're being, who you're being, self-reflection has to come from the inside, and she believes that she's alone in this. The way that she's writing implies that her household has nothing to do with who she is. And thus far into the book, maybe we think that it does, that without this household, that if David had been her parent instead of her boyfriend, she would have come across these concepts much earlier. Anyway, camp is over. David wants to drive her home, and her mom wouldn't hear of it. She says, you're a 14-year-old girl, and he's what, almost 18? Absolutely not. Mom decides to parent 14 years into it. It's kind of a crazy concept, and understandably, Patrick maybe revolts. We arrive upon another problem. David seems to be dumping her because he's going to college and she's starting high school. I have feelings about this, but they're not the point. As they're sort of parting ways, she's trying to convince him that they are going to be together. Everything's going to be okay. This wasn't just a summer romance. I'm in love with you, right? And she says, besides, how am I supposed to stay safe without you around? Patrick has again attached her agency or autonomy to someone outside of herself. This gives Patrick a lot of responsibility and virtually zero control. When you feel that kind of responsibility and you don't have any way to ensure that you meet those responsibilities, things like OCD or OCD thought patterns do pop up. Now we're in part 2, chapter 7. It's called Pops of Color. It starts on Sunset Boulevard, so we're made to believe she's back in California and she's stolen a car. There's a wallet in the car. She steals one of the credit cards. Don't leave your wallets in your cars, folks. So we've done sort of a time jump. It's been 6 months since she's left home from college, and nothing is going to according to plan. So Patrick tells us that her desire to attend UCLA is less about college and more about distance. She's lived in a small town, and she's found ways to keep her violent urges at bay, or she calls it the darkness at bay, and she recognizes that what she needs is a big city because a big city is going to provide her some anonymity as she breaks into houses and steals cars. And she's not wrong. The city where my father now lived afforded me a luxury I'd only ever dreamed of. Automatic obscurity. With its vast geography and millions of residents, I could be anyone I wanted to be in LA. I could disappear. Another reason she says she wants to leave home is she says it's become clear that her sister Harlow can maybe see through some of her act. It was a Saturday and we were in the den. Harlow was on the couch drawing in her sketchbook while I played a video game. She slid her latest work in front of me. In the center of the page, she'd drawn a large A, an amassed female superhero wearing a cape. Captain Apathy, it was captioned, for untruth, injustice, and the anarchist sway. I studied the image of the caped crusader and the words she'd added to the speech bubble above her head. Never fear, Captain Apathy doesn't care. Whoa, I said quietly. I was uncharacteristically speechless. It's you, she said proudly. My favorite superhero. That's sad. I may not have known what made me so different from everyone else, but I did know that I was no superhero. If anything, Harlow was my superhero, a naturally good person. She didn't have any demons to slay or secrets to keep or destructive urges to navigate. It was almost as if, when we were born, I was accidentally given an extra dose of darkness. Her dose. Fortunately, college provides an ideal solution. She doesn't have to worry about hiding from her mom or rubbing off on her sister. Her desire not to influence her sister with her darkness or toxify her sister's blood with her darkness demonstrates what, folks? Compassion, understanding, love. She believes if she doesn't have anything to rebel against, she won't feel these same destructive urges. She'll think she'll be normal. She says initially this was the case. Life in Los Angeles was blissful. Normal even. I didn't care about anything except the fact that I didn't care. And that made me feel like finding someone to stab. It's not funny, I'm laughing because I'm uncomfortable. She takes an intro to psychology course. It's her favorite class that first year. The class starts with a survey and an introduction to what a normal psyche might be. Apathy is a hallmark trait of many of the antisocial disorders. Take sociopaths, for instance. Sociopathy is a disorder characterized by disinclination to empathize with others. Psychologically speaking, sociopaths aren't well versed in compassion. They don't experience guilt like everyone else. They don't don't process emotion like everyone else. They don't feel like everyone else. And it is this lack of feeling, many researchers believe, that causes them to behave aggressively and destructively. The sociopath's subconscious desire to feel is what forces him to act out. Another thing that's confusing Patrick all through her childhood, up until this point, adolescence, is that it's the gender of it all. Sociopaths are always defaulted to hymns. Male prisons is where she first learns the term, and even in her professor's explanation, it's a default hymn. There were enough people like me to justify an entire psychological category, and we weren't bad or evil or crazy. We just had a harder time with feelings. We acted out to fill a void. Suddenly it was all so simple. The pressure I'd experienced my entire life was most likely caused by my own subconscious drive for feeling. It wasn't some insurgent that needed to be eradicated. It was more like psychological software patch my brain applied to counteract my lack of emotion. My bad acts were, in fact, a type of self-preservation. They counteracted my apathy. Doing something I knew was morally unacceptable was a way to force a pop of color in a psyche that is black and white. I craved it, which is why, on that night during my first year at UCLA, I found myself cruising the streets of Los Angeles in a stolen car. The owner was a sloppy drunk frat boy named Mike, heir to a potato chip dynasty. He was not my first victim. Okay, so this has become a habit. Patrick says she goes to frat parties and she borrows cars as her go-to feeling finder. College parties offered some of the best people watching in town. These gatherings were a virtual masterclass in social interaction and featured every type of behavioral observation imaginable. Attending them was like getting a jolt of feelings by osmosis. The bigger the party, the easier it was for me. I'd arrive and then disappear into a flood of strangers, reveling in my invisibility. She says it's like being an emotional anthropologist. Patrick says that at these parties, she sort of remembers her performative behaviors, that she can mimic appropriate emotional response. She said when they were growing up, she'd look to her sister for emotional cues, and it's how she was able to mostly fly under the radar, by playing good girl, by pretending to be her sister. The problem was that this disguise was not legitimate and it didn't actually fit. What's interesting is, again, Patrick assumes intention. She assumes that someone else's outer world is a reflection of their internal world, that the external is truly validating and translating the internal. She says Harlow, with her vast emotional depth and limitless empathy, was nothing like me. Adopting her personality was like wearing a dress that was 2 sizes too small. That makes sense because her sister's quite a bit younger than her. But more than that, I guess what's bothering me about this is that it keeps happening throughout the book, this assumption of intent. And while Patrick is simultaneously telling us that what other people saw, what she was presenting to the world was not real, what other people were presenting to the world was. She can't know that. And it's probably not true. Anyway, so she goes to these parties and she tries on other people's personalities. She says it's like an unlimited amount of fabric with which she could craft her own disguise. She's experimenting with as many emotions as she can, and then she alters the most suitable ones to fit. Alone in her dorm, she practices mannerisms that she's picked up from other people that she saw at parties. When she has them perfected, she tests them on live subjects. She says the results were quite astonishing. You understand what I'm saying when I'm saying this sounds a lot like masking? Like that it's possible at this point in the book. Obviously, violence aside, and it's hard to put that aside. Patrick is putting it aside. It sort of looks like an undiagnosed neurodivergent person trying to understand themselves while also believing that they understand other humans. I learned that touching someone on the arm during a conversation quickly rendered them more comfortable. I also learned that starting any conversation with a compliment or an unexpected question was the easiest way to disarm a stranger. For the first time, people seemed to warm to me authentically. What does that mean? That there was nothing authentic about my interactions didn't matter. Classmates were suddenly eager to chat me up around campus. Dorm mates were stopping by my room to socialize. These changes, hardly noticeable to anyone else, were extremely powerful to me. They were like breadcrumbs, leading me down a path towards social inclusion. It's just a kid that wants to be loved. To be clear, it wasn't approval that I craved, it was integration. The trick to going unnoticed was not to isolate, but to infiltrate, to assimilate. By assuming the personalities of other people, I was no longer getting the look. Dishonesty, once again, had proven to be the safe choice. She says once she understood the driving force behind her compulsions, she was less concerned about them. She no longer has to grapple with whether or not she's evil, and instead gets to recognize that she's a normal human, having a normal human response. Normalizing mental disorders, specifically the various symptoms of mental disorders, is essential to counteracting the stigma associated with those symptoms and replacing it with knowledge, understanding, and eventually acceptance. Perhaps even healing and change?
So we're at this point where Patrick is defining for us what the DSM is, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's sort of like she's using the term the Bible of psychology. It's used as a tool used to diagnose, and the reason that we need diagnoses in the field of psychology is largely for insurance reasons. We have to bill for something. She has to bill for something. In order to get insurance to cover your care, if you're going to see a therapist or get any sort of mental health treatment, insurance has to know what they're covering and what they're treating. So that's what it's for. Obviously, over time, there's been some debate about the validity of the diagnoses inside of the manual, because each new version of the manual that comes out, like right now the DSM-5 is the version that psychologists currently adhere to, but things change from version to version, as they should, right, as the field grows, and the field hasn't always been allowed to grow. The research that goes into understanding mental illness is something that gets sort of started and stunted depending on the culture, depending on the kind of money that we're willing to put into it as a society. So there's this DSM, right? At one point in time, homosexuality was in the DSM. So like the DSM reflects the problems of the age. Anyway, sociopathic personality disturbance is in an old version of the DSM that she finds. She's working really hard to try to understand this thing about herself. Why can't she feel? So sociopathic personality disturbance is in a previous version of the DSM, but it's not in the most updated version of the DSM that she is working with and that the therapist that she'll eventually work with can recognize. So it gets replaced with antisocial personality disorder, but the diagnostic criteria are not at all the same. Patrick is sort of railing against this idea that sociopathy, psychopathology, and antisocial personality disorder all get grouped into this one thing. And psychopathology and antisocial personality disorder both include a certain amount of violence and it necessitates a criminal component. So right now, or in the version that she is reading at this point in time in her collegiate career, says that antisocial personality disorder, the term applies to individuals who manifest disregard for the usual social codes and often come in conflict with them as the result of having lived all their lives in an abnormal moral environment. Patrick really is laying out what it is to be a sociopath as if this has happened in a vacuum, as if she has happened in a vacuum. But this definition, as a result of having lived their entire lives in an abnormal moral environment, it does fit Patrick. Okay, they may be capable of strong loyalties. These individuals typically do not show significant personality deviations other than those implied by adherence to the values or code of their own predatory, criminal, or other social group. She believes that this description may as well have her picture next to it. And she says, this is technically about psychopaths. She says, why are psychopaths, sociopaths, and antisocial people all lumped together? The librarian she's talking to at the time says she's not really sure. So as she dives into the literature that's available, and there's not a ton available to her, and she takes this quite personally, and we'll talk about that later, antisocial personality disorder was different from sociopathy, at least based on its diagnostic list. Certainly there were similarities between the two, but the criteria for each was distinctive. While I could easily identify with most of the traits on the sociopathic and psychopathic checklists, I was only able to relate to about half of the antisocial ones. This creates a problem, right? Because Patrick has her whole life sort of been looking for a way to treat this thing inside of her, the building of the pressure that she believes compels her to do violent things. And while she maintains for us that she doesn't really experience fear, not of consequences, that she doesn't really care, she devotes a significant amount of her time and energy to making sure she doesn't hurt anybody. It sounds like fear. It sounds like conscience to me. Okay, so after going to the library and doing her own preliminary research, she reaches out to her original professor that introduced her to the clinical term sociopath. This doctor says most psychologists agree that an antisocial personality assessment is only the first step in diagnosing someone as a sociopath. Patrick says that doesn't make sense. She says, because in order to be diagnosed as antisocial, you need to have been labeled a criminal, and at a very young age. You have to have been arrested or expelled from school, not just once, but multiple times. It says so right here. There has to be evidence of a conduct disorder, but in order to have evidence of a conduct disorder, you have to get caught exhibiting bad conduct. Patrick stabbed somebody in the head, and she did get caught, does get caught, but she's also a beautiful, wealthy white woman. So consequences are different from her. She is, categorically, the least likely type of person to end up in prison. Is she not afraid of consequences because she can't understand them, because her brain doesn't have access to that, like her synapses don't fire that way? Or does she not feel fear for consequences because they don't apply to her? I'm not trying to argue with the author about whether or not she's a sociopath. Sort of trying to point out that maybe sociopathy as a word exists and labels are important. It's important to understand ourselves, and whether or not it's something that's curable, whether or not it's something with an origin that's capable of being resolved, this is the question I'm trying to answer. This doctor says, that's an interesting observation because not everyone gets caught. Not everyone is compelled to violence so extreme that it would have consequences such as like getting expelled or going to prison. What if only a handful of sociopaths are the extreme type, the ones getting arrested and expels? Sociopathy as a spectrum disorder. She says, yeah. Her and the doctor engaged with this as it relates to theory, and then we dive into the difference between psychopaths and sociopaths, which, colloquially, the terms are used interchangeably, so it's cool to have this definition. Psychopaths are believed to suffer from brain abnormalities. It's why they make the same mistakes over and over. They are biologically incapable of learning from punishment or understanding remorse or even experiencing anxiety. But sociopaths are believed to be different. While their behavior is often just as bad as psychopaths, they appear to be more capable of evolution. Their issues seem to be more environmental than biological. This is what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to say that it's her environment that led her to develop this way. And development, like the word itself, it means change. Anyway, this particular doctor, this is Patrick's first encounter with someone who she might be able to confide in. First professional encounter where she might be able to confide her sociopathic tendencies, and this doctor does validate that there is a correlation between sociopathy and increased anxiety. And Patrick recalls this stuck stress that she remembers feeling very early on in childhood, even pre-kindergarten. Okay, now Patrick lays out for us a psychologist who identified 8 fundamental feelings he termed the primary emotions: anger, fear, sadness, disgust, surprise, anticipation, trust, and joy. This is interesting because there's other literature to combat this idea. Oftentimes, anger in the current field of study is considered a secondary emotion, not the first thing we feel. Usually how we feel about how we feel, right? Like if I'm having an anger or frustration response, it might be because I actually feel a grief, a sadness, a betrayal, some version of sadness or fear that kind of translates itself into anger because that is more societally acceptable as an emotion we can express, especially for men. And 2, it can, there's effective release for anger. I can punch a wall and I might feel different. Anyway, this doctor, she says empathy, guilt, shame, remorse, jealousy, even love, these are considered social emotions. We're not born with them, they are learned. Sociopaths and psychopaths both struggle to connect with the social emotions. Some researchers believe that they aren't capable. Patrick kind of pushes back, says, wait, aren't capable or are limited? It's interesting to read this book knowing that Patrick, evolves and becomes a therapist and obviously an author. Because not only is she confessing to us, right, she's being very truthful about behavior and thoughts and feelings, she also kind of comes at it from this very all-knowing perspective. Like the way that she's laying out this first encounter as a freshman in college, she's taking credit for ideas. It kind of is affirming, it feels like narcissism. So we know that when we socially talk about narcissism, what we really mean is stunted emotional development. Some of us as humans, when we're stunted in that way, we have a tendency to externalize our emotions, to blame other people for the way that we feel. You might see or experience this in your own life. There's probably someone around you who makes you feel responsible for the way that they are feeling. If you reject someone, like classic example is for women, like it's very scary to reject a man at a bar because if he feels rejected, he's probably going to blame you for the shittiness that comes up inside of him. That's externalization. So on the spectrum of emotional immaturity / narcissism, there is a level of externalization, and the bottom of that spectrum, the most intense part of that spectrum, is sociopathic behavior. We know that Patrick learned very early on to externalize her emotions. She's using her mom as her emotional compass. When you externalize everything, you feel a certain amount of responsibility for your emotions, but you don't believe you have any sort of control over them. I'm thinking, 33% into this book, that maybe that's what's happened with Patrick. Diving back into the book, this doctor says, apathy has an apparently profound, although dramatically under-examined, impact on the psyche. Think about it. What happens when a brain, which has evolved over millions of years to thrive based in no small part on its ability to acknowledge and feel emotions, cannot access or interpret them? It must be frustrating, like phantom limb syndrome. Psychopaths and sociopaths are in the same boat because they're constantly looking for a way to connect those pathways, to feel. It's why they behave so destructively. It's why they're so dangerous. Eventually, the constant weight of apathy becomes too much to take. And when that happens, they snap. If it feels like I'm repeating myself, it's because this book is repeating itself. Anyway, this is kind of revelatory for Patrick. She knows that she's capable of snapping. She's always known she's capable of violence, and worse, that she gets internally rewarded for violence. This life, this endless quest for feeling against the crushing weight of apathy was exhausting. It reminded me of the title of one of my favorite albums, Little Earthquakes by Tori Amos. That's what my behaviors were. Little earthquakes, generated to relieve pressure and prevent the big one. Patrick, is speaking through metaphor a lot in this book, and I'm not relaying it entirely to you because it doesn't feel relevant and there's a lot to talk about, but she loves music. She's always been obsessed with music. It's something that has really stabilized her. More than that, her favorite genre of music is jazz, which is a highly emotional music genre. Music is feeling. I'm not trying to invalidate the struggle that Patrick has obviously always felt. Like, clearly, this is a person that has been in agony for a long time, who has fundamentally rejected themselves and spent their entire lives trying to contort themselves into something that is socially appropriate. But a love of music indicates a capacity for feeling. After all, music is an expression of feeling, but more than that, music is a tool that helps us locate what is already inside of us. All right, so after she's done the research and finds that there's not a lot of information available on what she believes is her diagnosis, because she is self-diagnosed, and again, the reason there's not a lot of information available is in part the field, but it's also in part that this diagnosis has sort of been discredited as something that's not necessarily real. It hasn't been replaced by anything, it hasn't been explained, there's been negligent research in this area. And there's a reason. Not because it's not understandable, but because maybe it's something else. Trauma. Okay, so I'd gotten my wish. I was invisible, at least as far as my diagnosis was concerned, but I was also alone. She spends so much time talking to us about how different she is than everybody else. How she's perpetually misunderstood. That's a feeling. And not an uncommon one. Raise your hand if you've ever felt misunderstood. Raise your hand if you feel misunderstood right now. Raise your hand if I'm misunderstanding her as we speak. This leads Patrick to start questioning. Why was she superficially charming and prone to lying? Why did she feel this constant pressure to do bad things? Why did unacceptable behavior restore her internal equilibrium? I hope that we find out. She believes that the limited academia available to her on this subject of what she believes is her diagnosis means that she won't get to make meaningful relationships. This is flawed logic. It's emotional logic. because she has relationships with her sister, so much so that she moved across the country to protect her sister from herself. She had a relationship with David, however inappropriate it may have been at the time. She's had relationships with her mom. She had a relationship with a nanny. She has meaningful relationships. This next chapter, chapter 9, is called Prescription. I should get a job, I thought one afternoon, as I eyed the set of keys my neighbors had dropped off next to their car, so I don't wind up in jail. It wasn't the first time I'd considered it. Summer break stretched from June until September, a veritable workshop of idle hours my devil side wanted nothing more than to get her hands on. Patrick has so much privilege. She gets to go to college on her dad's dime, living in his house in very wealthy neighborhoods, and she has to get a job to fill these hours. And while I have compassion for this plight, it's hard to empathize with it because most people don't have access to this kind of privilege. Most people have to have a job in college in order to eat. Mass media references rubber-stamped sociopaths as loathsome villains with few exceptions. Some even promoted sociopathic isolation, an argument I found to be particularly dangerous. These people should be avoided at all costs, one infuriating magazine article stated. Where are sociopaths supposed to go for help? I wondered. These were human beings, after all. Sociopaths were said to have no conscience. They were said to have no soul. The books I found said sociopaths couldn't be treated and couldn't be controlled. They were completely unpredictable, unemotional, and dangerous to society. They lacked self-awareness and the capacity for emotional development. We know that's not true because Patrick has been self-aware her entire life. She has spent so much time managing other people's perception of her, which is another example of that responsibility to control ratio. You can't control how other people see you. You can't control what other people think of you. And she believes it's her responsibility to do so that she doesn't get caught. This also feels familiar to masking tendencies. The data tells a different story, she says. Deep in the research stacks, I found multiple studies indicating that all sociopaths were not, in fact, monsters hell-bent on destruction. Rather, they were people whose default temperament made the learned social emotions, like empathy and remorse, more difficult but not impossible to internalize. This made sense to me based on my own experience. We just talked about externalization. Internalization is the opposite thing. Someone who's grown up in a household where their basic and psychological needs have been met are able to fully individuate, which means that they do a little bit of both, right? They're not internalizing the situations around them, so to speak. Rather, they recognize boundaries. Patrick has been clear with us that she has no boundaries. She has no sense of self. She either gloms onto other people, or is sort of floating aimlessly, and it's that aimlessness that leads her to destruction. So she says she can't internalize empathy and remorse. And when she says internalize, does she mean process? Unclear. This is when she starts to notice that in old versions of the DSM that have a diagnostic criteria that help clinicians diagnose unreliability and failure to follow any life plan, numbers 4 and 16 on the list were supposedly universally characteristic of the sociopathic personality, but they could not be applied to her, right? She was incredibly reliable when she wants to be, and she's a decent student and had been rigorously disciplined when it came to getting into UCLA. Yes, she says I was frequently untruthful or insincere. I also lack empathy and could tell I wasn't working with a full emotional deck, but that was the point. I noticed these things. She was aware. In the literature, she gets to a space where she sees psychopaths aren't capable of love, but she knows she was in love once. That means she's definitely not a psychopath. She is capable of love, which is a complex social secondary emotion. That I had once been in love was evidence that I was capable of learning the social emotions. The relationship may have been short-lived, but it happened, and she's right. She says that relationship with David reminds her of the years in San Francisco when she'd sit under the table and happily confess secrets to her mother. She says that type of safety had long been abandoned, traded, with good reason, for protection afforded by deception. But what I gained in security, I lost in companionship. It was isolating. And part of me yearned to be seen, to experience safety through the lens of authenticity. This is not an uncommon feeling. That's why she liked talking to David. She didn't have to lie to him, and he accepted her for who she was. The word sociopath was popularized in 1930 by the psychologist G.E. Partridge, who defined the disorder as a pathology involving the inability to conform behaviorally to prosocial standards. In other words, these are people who don't act in ways beneficial to society and rather intentionally provoke discord. It's interesting when we get into categorizing human behavior, because society and the rules of society are constructed. They're not inherent, they're not primal, and they're different. They vary from culture to culture. There are considerations here that we need to be examining, that it doesn't feel like Patrick is examining, because she's generalizing the experiences she's had to sociopathy to explain to us and to justify her behavior in some sense, while at the same time, like it's incredibly individualistic. According to several studies, sociopaths comprise nearly 5% of the population, about the same percentage of those who have a panic disorder. It seemed crazy that a condition affecting millions wasn't given greater attention by the Psychological Association, particularly when the primary trait of sociopathy is apathy, and the primary consequence of unabated apathy is destructive behavior. What are all these people doing to keep themselves in check? Anyway, to keep herself in check, she, the book goes back and forth between being like highly educational and then, narrative. So she gets a job as a nanny because she reasons that children weren't as likely to notice that she isn't normal, which sort of defies her own logic, because she's told us before that children, when she was a child, noticed that something about her was off. My intense feelings for those kids and instinct to protect them at all costs gave me an additional boost of hope. Because she's feeling for those kids, the protective nature, maternal instincts, might be love. Sounds like a meaningful relationship. She stumbles across a book, A Study of Anxiety and the Sociopathic Personality, in the Journal of Abnormal and Social Psychology. It had taken her weeks to track it down. After testing the anxiety levels of dozens of sociopathic subjects, this Dr. David Lincoln concluded that there was a subcategory of sociopathy which he labeled as secondary or neurotic. He later theorized that this type of sociopathy may not be genetic, but was instead associated with stress caused by emotional frustration and inner conflict. Stuck stress. Patrick seems to, she keeps telling us that maybe this is a product of environment, and yet she's not connecting any of the dots for us. She's telling us the same thing over and over again. Apathy results in destructive behavior. Apathy feels like pressure in my chest, while also not leading us to where resolution may actually lie, which is in her relationship with her parents. I think. One woman's opinion. Anyway, she also recognizes that her reaction to apathy was not always discomfort. At times, she even enjoys this experience. It's only when she learns that she's meant to be ashamed of her apathy, or that it's abnormal and it freaks people out, she cares that it freaks people out, that she starts to become afraid of it. Again, a fear response. Dun dun. The bottom line was this: in order to remain an active, albeit secretly dysfunctional member of society and continue to enjoy all the perks of membership, I would have to alter my anxious response. I would have to accept my apathetic nature instead of being apprehensive about it. The longer I allowed my apathy to build, the longer I waited to dole out my fix of feeling, the more likely I was to become anxious, and the less likely I was to properly control my response. So why wait? She builds herself like this trouble schedule. She's had these rules. She won't hurt anybody, but essentially builds time into her schedule when she breaks rules as sort of like a pressure release valve. She breaks into her neighbor's house. She seems comfortable breaking, ethical rules, but her morality sort of seems intact. She breaks into her neighbor's house. The silence of a structure that has just been broken into is unlike any other. It's almost like the house can't believe what just happened and has gasped, taking all the air with it. I just wanted to read you that line. I thought it was good. Sort of the opposite of the response that she describes in her chest. Chapter 10. Confession. Despite my outward appearance as a responsible and well-adjusted, socially acceptable young adult, I still struggled with the one problem I'd had since I was a kid. I was alone. Being on what I considered the sociopathic spectrum often felt like a life sentence in emotional solitary confinement. No one could relate to me. Nobody wanted to spend time with me. Not the real me. She soon notices that the urge for physical violence gets a lot more prevalent when she's alone for long periods. This is especially the case on weekends, which she would often go days without seeing anyone. At this point in time, she's talking to us about how her relationship with her father is developing. Patrick in this book shares very specific pieces of information with us, and they're quite rudimentary. Either she doesn't value her relationship with her father, or she doesn't think it's relevant to the content of this book. It is. I know my father wasn't a fan of my decision to work while still in school. From his perspective, college was a time to cut loose and have fun. Her dad's like, don't have a job. You don't need one. Relatable. Anyway, she also says that her dad really values hard work. No one values hard work more than he does. Anyway, so she kind of lives this double life where she does a little bit of like what I would call vigilanteism. She's stealing cars from frat boys in her, like, on the weekends. She decides to confide in her dad. She recognizes deceit, however effective at keeping me safe, was exhausting. I was a monotonous combination of counterfeit personality traits and falsified storylines, and I was sick of juggling. Again, masking. So she decides to confide in her dad, and her dad's kind of like, we always thought there was maybe something about you. And she's like, you thought I was going to be a serial killer? And he seems a little bit sad and embarrassed and is like, not really. And she's like, I was joking. It's fine. She says, I smiled, attempting to put him at ease. She believes other people's emotions are her responsibility. That's what her parents have taught her. Their relationship has sort of switched. She's the parent in this conversation. She is moderating how much she is going to tell him based on his comfort level. She doesn't want to make him afraid, when really the reverse should be true. He should be reading her. She's reading him. Patrick is describing a hypervigilance in the way that she is analyzing people all the time. She confesses to him that she started going to funerals. She sort of feels like an emotional vampire. She goes to funerals and she really, really appreciates the intense expression of emotion going on there. She says it's unlike anything she's ever experienced. Grief is a complicated feeling. Bereavement is a complicated feeling. And the fact that Patrick hasn't had anyone close to her die also reflects a certain amount of youth or naivete in her. So yeah, she goes to other people's funerals. She tries to be very respectful when she goes. She brings flowers. Sometimes she writes a check to sort of pay for the emotion she's absorbing in the room, which is a little complicated, but perhaps not that crazy. Like, what she's looking for is genuine feeling, and that's what she's finding there. And it's alarming that she can't find it anywhere else, like in her home. She says, I don't care about things normal people care about. I don't like interacting with people because they don't connect to me, and I can't connect to them. I took a deep breath. But just because I can't connect doesn't mean I don't wish I could. I didn't choose this. I didn't decide to be someone who doesn't feel the same way as everybody else. And I think I'm getting better at accepting it, but it still sucks. I'm isolated. Physically, socially, emotionally, all of it. Everything about me is a fucking contradiction. Her dad's like, aw, honey. Then her dad is like, you should come work in my industry because not having any sort of remorse might really be an asset there. Red flag. Okay, chapter 11 is about borderline. Borderline personality disorder is a disorder with a lot of stigma around it. People with borderline are colloquially known as being manipulative and highly dramatic. It's often confused with sociopathy because a lot of behavioral diagnostics are similar. Like the observational things are kind of similar. Unstable relationships, impulsivity, self-destructiveness, habitual emptiness, anger, hostility. Many of those traits overlap. Same with narcissism, actually. But the behavior is motivated by different things. Borderlines act out due to an abundance of feeling. Sociopaths act out because of a deficit in feeling. What we're learning now, though, is that a lot of women who have been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder may have just been women with undiagnosed ADHD. And going undiagnosed with any sort of neurodivergence your entire life is extremely traumatic, and does lead to a deep lack of connection and desire to be loved because, I'm going to say it again, there's this fundamental rejection of self that takes place. It's all about attachment. People who suffer from borderline personality disorder are desperate for love. It's why they tend to be hyper emotional. Other people are perceived as self-objects. In other words, borderlines don't view others as separate individuals, but as extensions of themselves. I don't love the phrasing of this, right? Like, borderlines is like kind of a shitty thing to say. Sociopaths, on the other hand, are not motivated by attachment. If anything, their view of the world is shaped by a lack of attachment, but that worldview is similarly egocentric and one-dimensional. That's why people get them confused. The reason we're talking about borderline personality disorder is because Patrick has met a friend who she finds like reprehensible and kind of revolting. She appeared incapable of empathy and immune to shame, and she's frequently dishonest. And that person really identifies with Patrick because Patrick has taken to telling people in this field, right? She's taken a job with her dad and she's working in the music industry, that she is a sociopath. She meets this girl and she regularly complains about feeling empty. She's frequently impulsive, and her behavior, like Patrick's, is often destructive. She's also highly insensitive, demonstrating either impunity or indifference to other people's boundaries. But that's kind of where the similarities stop. Patrick describes working in this industry. She says, distracted by the allure of the music and carefully crafted mystique of the artists, few paid much attention to the shadowy figures lurking behind the scenes. Yet this was where the real magic was taking place. The dark magic. The music business was a cruel and shallow money trench, a long plastic hallway where thieves and pimps run free. Not only did most of the people I met appear to embrace her personality type, but many people seem prone to co-opt it. She tells people she's a sociopath, and music producers, random people are like, oh yeah, same. I don't give a fuck about anything. I like to do bad things. I like being a sociopath. So like, we can have bad actors in society, right? Like, people are shitty, and even the construct that we're all participating in, the rules, like the laws, are often oppressive to everyone that isn't a white guy. At this point in her life, Patrick is meeting with a therapist regularly, and the therapist says, like, it seems odd that you would care what other people think. And Patrick is like, I don't care what other people think. I do have survival instinct, though. Some need to stay hidden to keep people from finding out who I really am. Her doctor says, psychopaths and sociopaths all demonstrate a very specific type of social aggression. There's a lot of overt arrogance and antagonism. It's the primary way sociopaths establish social dominance. It's how they assert control. And Patrick is like, okay, am I like that? And the doctor's like, yeah, you are, but the way that you establish dominance is through manipulation and charm, which makes sense because you are a woman. Like, there is a highly gendered component of this. A female sociopath isn't necessarily going to use the same interpersonal techniques that a male one will. Like, gender bias exists inside of the very flawed tools that we use to diagnose people. And again, the reason that we're diagnosing people is, one, labels are important. They are. It's important to be able to understand yourself and like find other people like yourself. I have like a favorite quote that the reason that like ADHD and autism labels are important is because it's important to know that you're not a weird horse. You're a zebra, and it's okay to be a zebra, and you don't have to pretend to be a horse. You can find other zebras, and you can hang out with other zebras. You can also hang out with horses, but recognize that you're not one. So it's not weird that you're different than them. So I do think labels are important, but mostly the DSM is about insurance. It's about payment. It's economical more than it is meant to be about resource, support, help, treatment. Throughout their session, they're talking about sociopathy, and Patrick is feeling really bad for herself, which is something that she does a lot. That's what a lot of this book is. And again, I have compassion for the agony. I just don't think it's unique to her or to sociopathy. In spite of your difficulty connecting with others, your first impulse after being told your diagnosis was to look out the window and find someone else like you. It means you're looking for someone with whom you can relate. You're not looking for a friend. You're looking for empathy. My therapist's observation that I was an empathy-seeking sociopath was insightful, if not entirely surprising. Is it patronizing that she's saying the therapist that she's been seeing for a year has an insightful observation? I don't know. Back to this woman with borderline. She loathes her. Her excess emotion makes her uneasy, and while there's a method to Patrick's madness, this woman strikes her as unhinged. She says she's not a sociopath. She's worse. A knockoff. A sheep in wolf's clothing. And it makes her really angry because all these people doing really, really shitty things with nothing to sort of justify their shittiness, the way that the pressure in Patrick's chest forces her, compels her to violence. These people are violent with no justification. She thinks it's a real problem. Makes her very angry. Yeah, she recounts feeling disgust that this woman who maybe has borderline uses her sociopathic self-diagnosis as an excuse for her actions, whereas Patrick has never excused any of her actions. In fact, she spent her entire life finding herself unexcusable. So it makes sense that's confusing to her and upsetting. Something I just want to mention is Patrick names the Tarasoff versus Regents of University of California. It's the rule, right, that impacts confidentiality with a therapist. It requires that all therapists must report to the proper authorities any patient who poses a serious risk of inflicting bodily injury upon a specific victim. This is why therapists say, like, everything that we talk about stays between us, unless, of course, you indicate to me that you're a danger to yourself or someone else, in which case I'll have to report that. But that's the only thing that can be taken out of the confidential parameters of therapy, and it's cool that that's in there. And it's in there because Patrick's therapist threatens to fire her because she thinks that Patrick might be in danger of hurting someone else. We get into this conversation about behavior justification where Patrick, with a lot of sanctimony and disgust, says they're cheap fakes using my diagnosis so they can write off their disgusting behavior as some sort of symptom. And the therapist is like, you're the only one allowed to justify bad behavior. And she's kind of like, yeah, no one else can imagine the relentless, never-ceasing, all-encompassing fucking void of true apathy. And while Patrick is talking about apathy as one side of the coin, she also recognizes that other people, normal people, feel guilt and shame, like regularly, just like kind of as a constant, regardless of their behavior. Patrick is like, yeah, I recognize that I am being judgmental, but I don't care. Those people are lying, and she hates them. And the therapist is like, this is a concern, you're very angry and you're struggling, and the behaviors that you're reporting to me, she says, you were looking for a psychological release as a way to stabilize your mental process. You were engaging in a risk-driven act to reduce your apathy. She says you are hunting. You are escalating. I don't know if the therapist knows about the cat. The cat seems like the biggest escalation. Patrick tells us that she didn't kill the cat, and we can believe her, but she's also told us that she's a liar. So, like, the behavior that Patrick is seeing in herself doesn't really look like an escalation. It's not necessarily as concerning as the time she almost chokes out a cat. Linda Maley, this researcher, writes a paper on game theory and sociopaths. She said sociopaths are competitively disadvantaged individuals who use cheating strategies as a means of trying to make the best of a bad psychological hand. And Patrick says that's what she's doing, right? She's trying to game herself or trick herself out of her apathy. And it's not going to work. That's not coping. Her therapist agrees to continue seeing her, but only if they build a contract that says that Patrick won't engage in any illegal or risky behavior while they are engaged in treatment. And that makes Patrick really uneasy. An authentic relationship with my therapist was now contingent upon a promise I knew I couldn't keep. I was trapped. It was a dynamic that was unsettling and familiar because it's what has come up with her mom. This is not the way it should have looked with her mom. Parents are meant to love children unconditionally, and her mom's inability to do so, the shame and rejection that she sort of threw at Patrick the first time that Patrick was abnormal or unusual, is the reason that Patrick has developed this really deceitful nature. It's the reason that Patrick has spent her entire life perfecting this show that she's putting on, the personality traits that she's shrugging on and off. It's about that rejection. So this dynamic feels the same as that, and that makes sense. That's actually something that happens in therapy. We tend to project onto the therapist not only who we want them to be, but also who we need them to be. And who Patrick needs is a mom. She needs a parent. She needs an adult in her life. The book dovetails into this weird section about the Playboy Mansion where Patrick tells us that she is like on a first name basis with Hugh Hefner, and it's kind of like a brag. She likes Mr. Hefner. At this point in time, she's a 20-something young woman, so is it a surprise that Hugh Hefner likes her? I don't know. Especially, she describes herself as like a tall blonde. She's quite beautiful. She's admired by rock stars. She works in the music industry. She makes a lot of money. She comes from wealth. Her dad's connected. She is like, she's a nepo baby. And she likes Hugh Hefner, and she's sitting in his office, and she writes him a personal little note, and that's included in this book. She doesn't steal anything from Hugh Hefner's office, and she thinks David would be proud of me. And that's kind of that boundary enmeshment problem that you and I have talked about, wherein she's assigning conscious to someone else. David would be proud instead of, I'm proud of myself for engaging in behavior that aligns with my values. Something I want to mention is that the distinction between guilt and shame is that guilt is, I've done wrong, I've engaged in a behavior that contradicts what I believe my values and principles to be. Shame is, I am wrong. Who I am is wrong, bad. Hanging out in Hugh Hefner's office and thinking about David and thinking about how he'd be proud of her for not stealing anything or breaking anything leads to this sort of revelatory moment where she realizes that before she felt she was alone, it wasn't always bad things. Once upon a time, there was another way to make the apathy disappear. A flicker of light distracted me. Just before she knew these words, sociopath and sociopath is a term that she has coined for shitty people that call themselves sociopaths when they actually just mean assholes, repugnant assholes. There was a time when my feelings for someone else were so powerful they were all I needed to try harder, to be better, to a time when self-acceptance wasn't a task but a given, before I understood that I was different, before I felt like I was all alone. It wasn't always bad stuff, I thought. Once upon a time, there was another way to make the apathy disappear.
It was late one evening, a few weeks later, when I was startled by a knock at the door. So drama. Okay, so she opens the door and David's there. He's not sure if she was serious. A few chapters ago, it's mentioned that they're in conversation together, and she tells David that, he should just move to California and be with her because they've always been in love. Anyway, so he says, I've moved here for you. He shows up at her door basically with, all his belongings on his back. It was exactly the way I'd always dreamed it would be on the rare occasions I'd allowed myself to dream. In an instant, all my old feelings returned, splintering my apathy as they rose. This is more proof that Patrick is capable of deep, complex feelings, and that they break through her resounding theme or bubble or crust, hard shell of numbness. Overnight, she says she goes from an independent single woman to basically someone who's cohabitating. She kind of becomes a wife very quickly. For all intents and purposes, she acts as his wife. She spends the next few pages talking about the usual love story things. How the more mundane, the better. I embraced all opportunities to be conventional. Ordinary things like buying groceries or calling into bed with him at the end of the day made me feel effervescent with contentment. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just imagining a life free from emotional detachment and shadow self temptations. I was experiencing it. I was free. I wanted to shout my excitements from the rooftops. She's liberated from her previous sense of self and the claustrophobia that she feels in her chest. Because of David, because of the love that she has for him, but ultimately something that she has tracked back through the entire book, always maintained, that it's not necessarily about the love she has for him, but of his acceptance of her, of their close connection without her feeling like she has to protect him from herself or hide from herself in any way. She's talking to her dad, and she says, he makes me feel like all the bad parts of myself aren't bad at all. They're just misunderstood. She's explaining to her dad, kind of appealing to him, how much she loves him. It's like David has filled the space in my heart where those things are supposed to be, where she struggles with the lack of emotion. He's kind of filled in. He gives me a reason to be better. He makes me feel like I can be a good person too. It's true, David was patient, thoughtful, calm, but unlike my sense of calm, which was often simply indifference, David radiated a serene stillness. This wasn't just evident in his demeanor, but also in his marvelous ability to recognize the sublime and the simple. David is excited to be alive in a way that Patrick never has been. They build a life together, and Patrick is describing that life together. She prepares dinner, like she leans really hard into the homemaking of it all. All of these tasks were pleasure-delaying tactics that set the stage for my most cherished ritual, selecting the evening's soundtrack. Jazz music had always had a profound, almost paranormal effect on me. The rhapsodic notes never eased my apathy, but they did sit alongside it, like a silent companion or a perfectly paired glass of wine. With jazz blaring through my headphones, I felt less alone and more accepting of the nothingness inside. I never had to alter the lyrics to suit my vacancy. I never had to do anything but listen. It's a map. to feeling. When she's living with David, she says she didn't have to always be in control. I didn't have to be measured. I knew I was safe with him, and that meant I was free. I was free to be normal. I was free to make my dinners and drink my wine and seduce my boyfriend, and I was free to listen to my music every single night. She lets go. She relinquishes, and in that, she finds a lot of freedom. She believes she has to control herself to protect herself and other people from her and her urges, from her emptiness. And when she's with David, she knows that he will protect her from her urges. And obviously, he's filled in the space where there were previously vacancies. The next chapter is called Liberty, and it's about Patrick talking to her therapist, Dr. Carlin. Dr. Carlin is very clear that this is not going to last. This is a stopgap. Patrick is explaining that she believes in it, she's been cured by love, and Dr. Carlin says, you mean by proxy. That it's not permanent. None of this is permanent. Your apathy may be temporarily displaced, but it will come back. Dr. Carlin is emphasizing that Patrick isn't actually dealing with things. She's coping. She's found no resolution, and this coping mechanism is the same thing that she's done with her mom, the same thing she's done her entire life. She's allowing someone else to drive her sense of self. It's not going to work. After some time, Patrick starts to want to do bad things, not need to do bad things, not compelled. And by bad things, I mean she wants to walk into her neighbor's house and be in the empty house. It's for sale. There's nobody there. She's not hurting anyone. Morally, not complicated. Ethically, more so. And she decides to break into their house because she wants to, because she likes to. It's no longer, I need to steal this car or I'm going to do something very violent. It's, wouldn't it be fun to break into that house? And that is a really big distinction. And she's explaining this to David as sort of a success. It's her being driven by emotion. She's explaining it to him, and she says, it's good because so much of my bad behavior has been the result of anxiety, stress about the fact that I don't feel. But tonight, none of that was at play. Tonight, I did something I knew was wrong because I wanted to, not because pressure or stuck stress was forcing my hand, but simply because I could. It's like I allowed myself to just enjoy being me. I continued, and when I did, I got that euphoric feeling, a sensation of wholeness, which is self-actualization. David is worried that that's a slippery slope, doesn't think it's a good idea to break into other people's houses, and they devise a system where she can sort of confess to him quite passive-aggressively with a little statue that she'll put by their front door, and he'll know that she's done something wrong, and then they can talk about it. As the book continues to develop, we learn that Dr. Carlin's insights were correct, her intuition was correct, and all of that empathy that she'd been feeling, all of that wholeness was not necessarily a psychological breakthrough. It was all borrowed, likely the result of my proximity to David. It was as if I'd been awarded emotion by osmosis, normality by surrogate, and self-acceptance by proxy, which is really sad and true. Patrick is confused about where self-acceptance comes from, which is interesting because it's in the word, right? Like self-acceptance, acceptance of self. You are the only person that can reward it to you. And I hope that you do, because you deserve it. Denying yourself, rejecting yourself is doing nothing to ease any sense of shame. It's only propelling you toward the things that you hate or that you loathe or that make you feel so worthless. It's not about the externals. It's about what's going on internally. Patrick is working closely with producers from the TV show Punk'd. I don't know if you guys remember the show. I didn't watch a lot of it, but ultimately stars, rising stars, would have these like horrible pranks pulled upon them. And then they were meant to laugh afterwards, and like it was about the humor and amusement of the masses. And I think that's a real reflection of empathy at the time. It doesn't seem like the public has empathy, or certainly doesn't express it to one another. Maybe we're less evolved because the internet's in its early stages. I don't know. She's working with a producer on Punk'd, and she still discloses to people that she's a sociopath, and one of these producers, who's kind of a friend, believes her boyfriend's cheating on her, and she begs Patrick to break into her boyfriend's home and read his diary, because certainly that information will be disclosed there. So Patrick does it. She doesn't really want to do it, but she does it anyway. And she reads this diary, and the guy is completely innocent of any infidelity. She reads the whole diary through, front to back, and she's pretty grossed out, I think. She says, "I stood up and gritted my teeth. I can't believe I did this," I said to the shadows. "I felt off somehow, heavy. I didn't like it one bit." She, discloses to the friend that her boyfriend's not cheating on her, but she's clearly very snarky, and the friend's kind of like, "What's the issue?" And Patrick is like, "You forced me to do that." This is another representation of Patrick believing that her choices are dictated by anyone but her, whether it be compulsions, her shadow side, or someone who simply wants her to do something. She did this because she believed it would be somewhat helpful, and I believe that what she felt after she read that diary was guilt, revulsion. Frustration with herself, yes, for being compelled to do something that she didn't want to do, but also because she felt it was wrong, and that's personal development. Guilt. Nothing I'd done that day felt good. None of it had triggered the psychological release that some part of me was still seeking, and it made me furious, not just angry, but restless and desperate to swim back to my boyfriend and the normal life I'd managed to piece together with him. I mean, this kind of sounds like a story that maybe would normally take place in middle school. You do things that don't align with your conscience, and it makes you realize who you are. You're shaped by your emotions because they indicate your values to you. Her body is indicating values to her. Spending time with David and having been accepted with him has allowed her to more fully develop a sense of self when she isn't so strung up in her anxiety, and now she knows something about herself. Even as she's writing this book, it's not clear that she's arrived at this conclusion. After this happens, she leaves the Statue of Liberty keychain by the table, and she's hoping he won't notice it for the first time. She doesn't really want to confess. She doesn't really want to be confronted with this dark pit in her stomach that she felt after she did the shitty thing. He's like, "Yep, this is fucked up." He asks her if she feels anything about the fact that this is fucked up. She says, "I don't know. When I finished reading it, I definitely felt different. Not like I normally do when I've done something bad." She says, "Normally, I'd feel happy, relieved." She says, "But I didn't. It was more of a negative feeling, heavy almost. I definitely wouldn't do it again." He sighs and says, "Well, that's something at least." I don't understand why he's not having a bigger reaction to this, because that's a really big deal. That's the complete opposite of what has always happened her entire life. He's kind of more upset about why didn't you tell me? We went to dinner last night. Why are you only telling me now? Something I want to mention is that Patrick mentions that David had become increasingly wary of her father. He hates that she works for her dad and he wants her to quit. He's concerned about how often she's expected to attend meetings and late night concerts and kind of schmooze around with men in the industry who are also kind of well-known, notorious for being assholes. David and Patrick, in discussing this story, the way that this producer, this friend, used Patrick to get her to do kind of her dirty work, how that's not really friendship and how that's a bad sign. And David is he's likening sociopathy to a superpower that other people that are ruled by emotion, are using to exploit. She says she doesn't see it that way, and he says, "That's because you're not an asshole," David explained, "but trust me, most people are." He's saying she's not an asshole, and that's great because you don't want your boyfriend to think you're an asshole. Really, hopefully never your boyfriend. Your boyfriend should probably never call you an asshole. He probably shouldn't call you names. And though Patrick has been talking to us about her role in this music industry and how her shadow side is really, really helpful when it comes to doing these deals. And doing these deals, I think, pretty much means screwing artists out of ownership rights for their music. The job itself looks quite glamorous because she hangs out with a lot of rock stars and it's music centered, and she really loves music, but she's not being kind, right? She's not in this for service. She is being an asshole. And she's also described her dad's late night meetings with young aspiring professionals. Her dad is not cool. David professes, "I think your dad uses you sometimes." And David, kind of tells her, "I don't think you should be so open about how you feel or don't feel. There's really no upside." He says sociopaths don't always do the wrong thing, according to Patrick's research. So why open herself up to the exploitation? You have a choice about whether you want to be a bad sociopath or a good one, and it's your choice, Patrick, not anyone else's. As he's saying this, he's at the same time projecting his idea of what a good person is onto her and insisting that she live her life according to his values. And as it relates to long-term sustainable relationships, there's a piece of emotional intelligence here. Ideally, they should share some values, if not most values, and him insisting that she can be who he thinks she is maybe not the most healthy mindset either. Especially, while she's at the same time believing that who he believes she can be is the only reason that she is able to not engage in acts of violence or criminal acts. Later, she documents a conversation with her therapist. She says, when I first started researching, I saw that most sociopathic traits are behavioral. Lying, stealing, manipulation, antisocial tendencies, that's all behavior. And those behaviors are wrong, right? They're explicitly bad. There's no room for interpretation. But the psychological characteristics of sociopathy are not good or bad. Like, there's nothing wrong with apathy. You can use the traits to make good choices or bad ones, and the more we can normalize things like that, the more that sociopaths can be educated to understand that they're not wrong or bad, the less stress they're likely to have about it. Ergo, the less compelled they'll feel to act out because of it. Like, sociopaths might not be able to do anything about their psychological makeup, but they can be educated to change their behavior. She's saying this while doing something that impacts her psychological makeup, which is being in a relationship with David and finding ways to individuate, to let go of her anxious and toxic thought patterns. Sociopaths are unique because by default, we don't internalize things based on feelings or peer pressure. At least I don't have that struggle. She says it's a strategic advantage. So many people are ruled by emotion, dangerously so. Her therapist says, yes, but emotion doesn't always cause people to do bad things, Patrick. And Patrick says, yeah, but a lack of emotion doesn't have to either. It's the opposite side of the coin. And then she starts to explain that the reason she doesn't feel the stuck stress in her relationship with David is because it's gone. It's gone because I feel accepted. David doesn't judge me when I don't care about things. He doesn't think it's weird when I get quiet. I don't have to constantly be on defense about my apathy, so the apathy becomes less stressful. She gets to put down her mask. She says she can reframe her belief system. If you can educate sociopaths to understand that their inherent traits are not bad, then you can replace that anxious reaction with acceptance and maybe reduce the behavior, theoretically. So she's not trying to normalize behaviors like lying and manipulation. She's talking about normalizing the traits, the psychological traits. Remember, apathy isn't the cause of sociopathy. It's just a symptom. Then she describes her psyche to her therapist like this: the Great Blue Hole. It's this sinkhole off the coast of Belize. It's hundreds of feet deep, and all around it the water's light blue and crystal clear. But over it, where the seafloor drops out, the water's black. I looked out the window. It's one of the only things that has ever truly petrified me, which is, again, not the truth, but her self-awareness is, distorted. Self-image is distorted. My apathy always felt like an abyss, even before I realized it, even when I was a kid. I think I was scared of it because I never knew what monsters would come out of that darkness. And now, she asked. I shrugged. Well, now I've met the monsters, I smiled, and I surrender. It's a life lesson that all of us can learn. I don't believe myself to be a sociopath. I have a lot of feelings. But I think most of us feel we maybe don't battle the darkness inside of us, but recognize it. And, most psychologists, Carl Jung, namely, talks about striving for wholeness more than striving for goodness, and how rejecting any piece of yourself leads to real psychological distress. I'm just saying that Patrick seems to be making a case, several cases here, and one of them is that sociopathy is not studied because no one knows what to do about it, or no one knows how to fix it, or no one cares. I'm suggesting that sociopathy is not studied because it's not real. It's emotional immaturity, stunted development. She's talking to her therapist, and her therapist is like, well, you seem to have this figured out. She says, I got lucky. The only reason I understand any of this is because I just happened to find a bunch of research inside a library, which is not true. She looked for it. She sought it out. She did not happen across this research. Her therapist suggests that she has a gift for psychology and thinks she should think about graduate school, and that she should write a book. And obviously, we are reading said book, so we know that happens. You're a well-adjusted sociopath, for starters. Right, I said I'm a sociopath. Who the fuck's gonna believe anything I say? Other sociopaths, like you said, you can relate. You know what it's like to live with this. You've got a unique perspective because you can dissect it from both a personal and a professional point of view. Even if you don't have all the answers, you have the insight to understand other sociopaths and to help them just like you've helped yourself. They say sociopaths are impulsive, irrational, and capable of introspection. Then she shook her head. Not from where I'm sitting. They say sociopaths can't love, but I've seen you love. They say sociopaths are incapable of empathy. I'm not very good at it, I say quietly. Oh yes, yes you are. With other sociopaths. Now tell me, who else can do that? Patrick is thinking about this, going back to grad school, writing a book, becoming a psychologist, and David doesn't want her to do that. He wants her to quit her job because he thinks that her job is kind of seedy and shady, and he doesn't love the work she does with her dad or some of the abuse, misogyny that she's subjected to in the late evenings, the drugs. There's a lot going on. They get in kind of a fight. She says, you want me to quit my job. You clearly don't want me going back to school. And he says, because I'm trying to protect you. And she says, protect me from what? And he's like, last time you were in school, you were stealing cars off frat boys all the damn time. He's like, I'm here now, so I can take care of you. It's why you leave me this keychain. It's because this is my job. My eyes widened when I realized how much he'd misunderstood everything. Oh, David, no, I said, desperate to clarify. I leave it because I want to be close to you. I want you to know what I do because I want to be honest with you about everything, all the time, just like I'd promised. Not because I need you to protect me. I'm serious. I'm your partner, not some insane person you have to look out for. Their relationship has evolved. She's grown. She's been in therapy. Like, she's developing emotions, even though she doesn't seem to recognize it. But I kind of feel for David for a second here because she did 2 chapters ago tell us that the reason that she's safe now is because David's love protects her. It makes sense how these things got complicated, especially considering the gender of it all and the time. She decides to go back to school despite the fact that David doesn't think it's a good idea. Between school and work, David and I had become passing ships in a passive-aggressive ocean. Even after living with me for years, he couldn't wrap his head around the idea that his dream girl was a sociopath. So she's starting to understand that David's acceptance of her was his projection of her, who he believed she could be, who she was, and sort of also a rejection of the honesty that she had shared with him. He didn't get that it had nothing to do with being a good person or a bad person. It was a personality type, its traits simply a part of my psychological fabric. I started to get the sense that his acceptance of me had stopped being unconditional. He approached my sociopathy like it was a series of choices, and once he had no problem cherry picking. David, I noticed, was quick to vocalize his disapproval of sociopathic behaviors he didn't like, yet he was happy to co-opt elements of my personality type when it suited his purpose. He didn't seem to mind when I surreptitiously punished those I felt had wronged him, and he had no problem breaking into empty houses together to have sex. Which is a development from before, because I guess when she's breaking into empty houses by herself, he's cool with it, but as long as he's there, like the protector, macho, I get it. It was like I wasn't allowed to be a sociopath without his permission, and the hypocrisy felt frustrating. Understandable. The more time I spent studying psychology, the more convinced I was that guilt was a state of mind designed to oppress, not set free. It seemed to me that people didn't have to think for themselves as long as they had guilt doing it for them. Again, when guilt arises inside of you, yes, it is, especially in your early years, a product of your family of origin, your formative experiences, the messages you've internalized. I'm looking at you, Catholics. And it's a reflection of your values. You are allowed to examine, reflect upon your values, and sort of sort through what's coming up for you. Your values change as you grow, as you change. But this idea that guilt is meant as an oppressor is only true when it's wielded by an oppressive force. The rest of the time, it's meant to help us. evolutionary, it's primal, so that we can live in communities, so that we can trust each other and love each other, become intimate and still feel safe. From emotional reactions such as low self-esteem and propensity toward anxiety and depression to physical ones like increased sympathetic nervous system activity, including problems with sleep and digestion, the negative aspects of guilt and shame seem to far outweigh the positive. Okay, that is true, but she's also describing a bunch of things that she experiences. She has incredibly low self-esteem. She has a propensity toward anxiety and depression. It's why she can't trust herself to be alone for long periods of time. To physical ones like increased sympathetic nervous system activity, right? Problems with sleep and digestion. We've gotten at least two anecdotes of her being the only child awake at the sleepover. What presents as shame, but what she calls fear. Anyway, she meets this new friend who she says is by all accounts a great person, yet she was constantly having to fight off feelings of contrition. In a lot of ways, she and David were similar. She gets into sort of like people-pleasing tactics, people that are really good people, that don't ever do anything wrong, that set out not to hurt anyone, to serve their communities, still feel a lot of guilt and shame. And that is about oppressive structures being habituated to systemic oppression, especially this friend that she's talking about is a woman. Like inside of patriarchy, women are taught to be ashamed of like simple things like aging. It's not to suggest that aging is simple, just that it is inevitable and something that 100% of people, 100% of alive organic things experience. I just wanted to point out when she's talking to this friend offhandedly says like, you have no doubts because you're fearless. She's talking about how Patrick is undaunted by buying like a fixer-upper house. And Patrick's like, what can I say? There are perks to being a sociopath. Patrick is not fearless. This whole book is about how afraid she is all the time, which is the frustrating part of reading it. I'm glad that the book exists as an educational tool, but I think there's less utility in its education and more utility in its validation for folks that have felt similarly. Now we're at 64% of the way through the book, and we get into this new relationship with someone who is an unnamed rock star of the time, and the whole thing kind of feels like a name drop. Like this story never really goes anywhere. Forgive me, the story goes everywhere, but doesn't really seem to have a point other than to demonstrate for us that Patrick has no awareness of her feelings, that she does not understand them or know how to navigate them. Patrick starts to resent David's protectiveness. She feels it's more controlling. He cancels on her, bails last minute because they're not really seeing each other anymore. Their relationship is not at all harmonious or connected. And he sends her a text that says, be good. And she's like, why does he get to tell me how to behave? And I agree. If I got a text from my spouse that said, be good, I would be like, what? But I don't have a history of, violence. So, hard to say who's in the right there. Because of that text, she steals a car. This was an evolved sense of liberation, the kind that came from understanding myself and following my own instincts instead of having to placate someone else. Despite the glorious honeymoon period we'd enjoyed, my relationship with David was becoming stifling. They've been together for years and years, and they've known each other for at least a decade at this point in time. The honeymoon period, like as described by psychologists, it's called limerence, and it lasts about 3 months, and that's kind of that like rose-colored lenses, moony-eyed, obsessed with each other that isn't real love. So the fact that she's calling these years with David that were so happy and in a lot of ways liberating themselves a honeymoon period is her rewriting history, and she knows better because she's the psychologist. The pressure of feeling like I had to conform to his ideals and expectations filled me with anger, and not just any anger, but a familiar type of rage. It was a sharp spear of fury that had been forged in my childhood, the scars of which I'd spent most of my adult life trying to ignore. Instead of trying to cope with, trying to ignore. She avoids the things about herself and about her childhood that she doesn't like. She's doing it in this book. But what she's describing, that sharp spear of fury, she's triggered. Not in the colloquial sense of the word, like I'm triggered, but I mean her nervous system is triggered. It builds a panic response in her. And you know what's easier to process than panic? Anger. She's externalizing the way that she saw her parents do. In some sense, sometimes the way that she sees David do. Okay, so Patrick starts getting blackmailed. There's this woman named Jenny who is like the momager of someone that her dad is managing. Jenny wants both of her children to be stars and has taken to blackmailing Patrick with photos, illicit photos of her father and some young woman. Jenny includes herself, says that she also, is included in this explicit content. She's going to take this content to the police unless her dad decides to make her other kid a star. Patrick gives this explanation, sort of explains away her dad's innocence in this without ever touching the content of the illicit photos with, again, young women or people described as girls in the letter. But she doesn't really do anything about it. She ignores a lot of these emails until she gets to the point where she now, can use Jenny's criminal blackmail behavior and corrupt morality to justify her own desire to do something criminal herself. She starts kind of staking Jenny out, going to her house and watching her do innocuous things like the dishes and talk to her kids and stuff like that. At Jenny's, I felt a sort of desire, a longing for wickedness I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to contain, and she liked it. She says for a month, all she did was case the place. She doesn't tell David or anyone else that she's doing this. At the same time, her and David's relationship is sort of becoming more and more tumultuous and less connected. She kind of uses Jenny's blackmail, and the retribution that she's going to enact toward Jenny as a distraction from the way she feels at home. She says, if David no longer accepted me, I reasoned, then I didn't need to play by his rules. I could embrace my full self, which is very sad and also hugely problematic. She says, in a way, I felt like a tiger that had escaped the zoo. On one hand, I knew my father had a well-earned reputation for being a ladies' man. This is not something that ever really gets dissected as something that may have impacted Patrick growing up. She says that it's never bothered her. Maybe it should have, given the toll his wandering eye had taken on my mother. Again, she excludes herself from any damage that may have been done by not only her father's infidelity, but the fact that he is sleeping with young women who believe that he's going to further their career, which, makes consent quite murky. Except he, like so many men in his cohort, did a phenomenal job of normalizing it. He said, I'm a desperado, kid, just like the song. She says one time she was cleaning out the attic and stumbled across a stack of pictures of him with dozens of different young women in various stages of undress. This is horrifying for a number of reasons, because we know it's not just normalized within Patrick's dad's group of friends. It's an entire industry that normalizes this behavior. That way that history unfolds itself is things like the Me Too movement and women in this industry having to subject themselves to creepy old dudes in order to pursue their passions and make something of their careers. Patrick works alongside of this for a really long time. It's the reason that she has a bunch of money, and it's the reason that she's grown up in the privilege that she has. It's not something that bothers her, and we can chalk this up to her being a sociopath, or we can recognize it as something that has highly influenced her development as it relates to the development of a moral code. Obviously, these men around her aren't sociopaths. She spent a good amount of time explaining to us why they aren't. And yet, they don't really seem to have any concept of morality either, except that her dad doesn't want her to steal cars because it's illegal. I'm just saying I understand why she doesn't understand. Anyway, so after finding these photos in the attic, she doesn't do anything about it, but it does make Jenny's threat credible. So that means that she kind of has to do something about it, because she doesn't want Jenny to go to the cops, because she cares about her dad and his reputation, and she doesn't want him to be embarrassed. I knew better than anyone that I wasn't the best person to judge good behavior from bad, especially when it came to others. Dr. Carlin had confirmed this during one of our first sessions. You have what is called a high tolerance for pathology, she said. She said it means you have a high fear threshold. People and circumstances that most everyone else recognizes dangerous or problematic will not always register that way for you. Your judgment is skewed to perceive potentially threatening situations as non-threatening. It's quite common among sociopaths. So this is Patrick explaining to us why she decides to take matters into her own hand. She doesn't find Jenny's blackmail threatening. She recognizes it as justification for retribution. Why send her to prison when it was so much more gratifying to deal with her myself? I was uncaged, in a way, so I decided to make the most of it. One of these nights when she's staking out Jenny's house, she recognizes that she feels a compulsion toward real violence. She really wants to hurt Jenny, and this freaks her out. It makes her afraid of herself, and so she really starts to wonder about whether or not she should commit herself to a mental institution. She can't find an adequate institution that's going to help treat her diagnosis. Sociopathy was clinically obsolete when she calls and tries to facilitate her care. Sociopaths, the psychologist had theorized, don't suffer from any signs of psychosis the way that schizophrenics do. As a result, they're capable of logical reasoning and are believed to have control over much of their antisocial behavior. In other words, sociopaths are tempted to do violent things because they think they want to, not because they hear voices to compel them. In this way, there was no treatment program, no treatment available to help her fight these compulsions, to help her uncover the foundational beliefs that lead her to these compulsions. So she's kind of freaking out, and she feels like there's nowhere to turn, even though at this time she does have a therapist who she's been talking to, but she doesn't believe that she can tell this therapist, because to tell this therapist would be to admit that she's broken the contract that the two of them had made, that is that when the two of them are working together, Patrick won't do anything illegal. And Patrick's been stalking Jenny for a good portion of time. That would result in her termination with her therapist. So she feels like she can't get help. And that's a really scary way to feel, but it's also the way that she has felt her entire life, which is, again, a feeling based in fear. It's panic. She starts hanging out with someone that she calls Max, who is this rock star that she's never going to name. He takes a real liking to her, this rock star. They go out to dinner. She feels kind of guilty about it. Because she has a boyfriend, and she tells him that she has a long-term boyfriend, but she also tells him that she's a sociopath, and he's really interested in that because he also admits that he has a girlfriend who he's kind of avoiding, really loves him and wants commitment, so on and so forth. So Patrick kind of right away recognizes that what Max projects onto her is a woman that's never going to need anything from him, because he projects his idea of a sociopath, which is someone without feelings, which is obviously not what a sociopath is. When they hang out, she says, I already felt like I was having a conversation with an old friend, someone effortlessly engaging and uninterested in mindless chit-chat. So their relationship develops very, very quickly. She starts talking to him about his psychology. She's kind of diagnosing him, psychoanalyzing him. She says, you're worried you have a false sense of awareness. Like you can't trust yourself to know at any given time what is and isn't sane behavior. And that's sort of where Patrick finds herself. She never names it this way, but she recognizes that she doesn't have the instinct and the intuition that other people have as it relates to right and wrong choices, just general experiences, how to interpret and furthermore internalize them. So they have that in common. She gets kind of sidetracked in the book here, and we're at 72%, and like I've said, it's been kind of repetitive, so I find myself as a reader frustrated with Patrick because she doesn't trust me as a reader. She doesn't trust herself, so that makes a little bit of sense. How can you trust anybody else if you can't trust yourself? But this conversation with Max and the relationship that develops here, I think it's meant to be an interesting anecdotal counterpoint to her relationship with David, which has been the only sort of content of substance that happens throughout the book. It also feels like a little bit of a brag. I don't know, like she's hanging out with this cool rock star. Her life is very cool. It's giving kind of Daisy Jones and the Six, like wild child, let loose, tons of privilege, no consequence, without all the drugs and all the hyper-emotionality. Her and Max find this thing they have in common. Patrick names it as a boundary issue. People who don't have access to conventional boundaries are always looking for new ways to set them, just like me. Max asks if this means he's a latent sociopath, and she says, no, you need too much validation. Though I bet I could conduct a study on sociopathy and the negative effects of fame. Sociopaths don't recognize natural boundaries, and they aren't easily socialized as children, so they don't live by the same rules as everyone else. But that's the same things that happens to famous people, isn't it? The more they achieve, the fewer boundaries they have. They don't have to play by the rules, so they start acting destructively to find a new normal, to find new boundaries. They start acting like sociopaths, which is kind of a cool and astute observation, and it does explain that what's going on here is learned. They get deeper into a conversation about artists, particularly successful and famous ones, and the conflation of art, passion, and fame. And she kind of says that she feels bad for all the artists that she manages who are on tour. She says, where's the normalcy? Where's the life? She says that artists, they're trapped in a state of suspended impermanence because they're always moving from place to place. They stop evolving with the rest of society. I think that's incorrect. I think in a lot of ways, artists present something to us that is more evolved. Humans have historically and evolutionarily been dependent on communities, which is why sociopathy is something that is potentially so damaging. It's why everything in Patrick compels her, why her nervous system compels her to mask her differences, and why, high school is such a terrifying place. In the past, to be exiled from your community would mean to lose access to all sense of resource and protection. That's not necessarily the truth anymore, right? We live in a more individualistic society. More independence is required than maybe ever before. I think artists are the people that, like we've talked about, help to show us our humanity amidst the mundane, amidst the survival of every single day. I don't know if it's that artists stop evolving or if artists are evolved. I don't know. I'm just saying I don't think Patrick has all the answers, in case that's not clear from this entire reading. Patrick says that things with David are starting to deteriorate. I found myself inventing reasons to argue with him and then using his angry reactions to justify disappearing. She confesses that she's been making these trips to Jenny's house, and he's pretty upset. He's like, why are you stalking this person? And in that, she says, it was a hopeless dynamic that reminded me of my childhood. Once again, I regretted my decision to be honest. Amidst the deterioration of her relationship with David, her relationship with Max develops in a new way. He brings out a different side of her. He's really delighted by what she calls her darkness. He was like a recreational drug that made me feel invincible and strong. My saving grace was that I could only take so much. Being high on Max simply wasn't something I could do all the time, nor was it what I wanted. He was too flamboyant for me, and his access to nearly unlimited resources made him a frequent magnet for chaos. I, on the other hand, preferred discipline, so I was mindful of the dosing. This conversation comes after Max basically asks her to cheat on David and fly on his private jet to go on tour somewhere with him, and she's kind of like, no. She says, but the longer I contemplated a quick trip with Max, the heavier the sensation became. Was this guilt? She's wondering if even thinking about going out with Max, she's wondering if her relationship with Max is something that she's comfortable with. And she's right. This is guilt. She says she knew it wasn't because she'd witnessed guilt enough in other people, especially David. As a firstborn son of Catholic parents, he was often guilted into doing things against his will. I'm going to bring it back to the top here when I say that this is Patrick saying that she can read what other emotions feel like on other people's faces without having experienced them herself. This is narcissism. Anyway, while all of this is going on, she's still conversing with Dr. Carlin, and she kind of confesses or is willing to concede the idea that her feelings for David could never be a permanent solution and that she'd been using him. Without even realizing it, I'd been coasting off my love for him as long as I could to avoid having to deal with my problems. But now the cracks in our relationship were becoming impossible to ignore. The cycle of apathy and pressure had returned. Only now I had no way to handle it. I was out of practice. I didn't know what to do. And the pressure, the compulsive urge to act out, was once again starting to rise. Patrick. I'm on page 264. 75% in. Effectively, Patrick decides to treat herself, which is in some sense the way that all psychological treatment sort of works. She's gone to school to find answers about herself the way that other people with different diagnoses have been able to go to professionals to help explain them. She has tried professional treatment, and it's helping her cope, but it's not aiding her in any sort of resolution. So she's in school, and she's learning about different treatment modalities, and she's deciding which ones she's willing to try, and then she's trying them. In addition to school, she's also still working as a music manager. She says, working as a manager let me use my sociopathic traits with aplomb. Being a good talent manager required moral flexibility, which I had in spades. The entertainment world offered a relatively safe environment to me to flex my sociopathic muscles, and I was reluctant to abandon it.
She decides to grow her good side and nurture it with things like grad school and her relationship with David that encourage her, to try to change, develop more than kind of enable her shittier behaviors. Okay, so Patrick takes Max to go and stalk Jenny, and when she gets there, she observes that she finds Jenny quite pathetic, actually. Though it hadn't ever registered with me, Jenny did seem sad wandering around her little condo. She didn't look like an enemy deserving of vitriol or anything, really. This is a pretty intense moment because it means that Patrick's former sense of righteousness is probably misguided and misplaced. It's a product of a god complex and narcissism, and it's not particularly fulfilling. She does feel good. She does feel in control. She does feel in charge. She does feel like a puppet master when she's doing this. In fact, she even thinks to herself, I want a treatment plan that feels like this. She decides not to hurt Jenny with Max as her accomplice. When they leave Jenny's place, Max is excited by the adrenaline rush that he himself has gotten from scoping out Jenny's place. But Patrick has come to her own conclusion. She wants to go to the police. She knows that turning her in is the right thing to do, but she always knows that. She just doesn't feel it. Again, I don't think that this problem is exclusive to Patrick. Many of us do things that we know are wrong because we want to, because our feelings pull us that way. And that's what has happened to Patrick. Her feelings have led her to stalking this woman who's blackmailing her. But she decides to go to the police. Max is kind of trying to talk her out of it. He says, what are they going to even do? Probably nothing. She'll get off with a warning, and she's not going to get the justice that she so rightly deserves. And she tries to explain, it's not about Jenny, it's about her. It's not safe for her to have this random person out there as a convenient bullseye. I wanted to understand my urges instead of reacting to them. And these past few months I've been working on that, but now I don't know. Max is explaining to her why any retribution that she enacts toward Jenny, which I think what they're discussing is really violence, is something that she deserves because of her behavior. Patrick says they all deserve it. I choose people like her specifically because they deserve it, because they do things I can use to justify my behavior, but it's not good. Not feeling guilty, my missing emotions, none of that is good. Max is kind of insisting that these things that she's dealing with are actually strengths. She doesn't necessarily believe him. They walk away from this encounter, and later Patrick is confiding in her close friend, who is also a rock star. And the friend says, you like him. I'm not judging you, but what you're describing, that's what attraction feels like. Patrick is kind of floored by this. She did not realize that she has feelings for Max. But as a reader, it's kind of clear, right? Like, she describes feeling at home with him. They hang out a lot. She feels a little bit guilty when she's hanging out with him or doing things that she knows that David wouldn't necessarily approve of. And it's not necessarily bad things that she's doing with Max. She just gets that heaviness, that heavy sensation. And her friend is explaining to her, you can't pick and choose your feelings. When the basic feelings get stronger, the complex ones do too. While her friend is explaining to her that she's attracted to Max, her friend kind of implies that makes the friendship more illicit, resembles infidelity. And Patrick is very against this. My entire life I've been told I should feel bad because I don't feel things, and now you're telling me I should feel bad because I do. A friend says, I'm not telling you how you should feel. I'm telling you what you do feel. And that, my love, is probably why you're also now feeling the claustrophobic stress, because you feel trapped by feeling. This rock star friend of hers makes a case very similar to the case I feel I have been making, which is that Patrick knows who she is in relation to other people, but who is she when no one else is around? The problem is you're not allowing yourself to be that person, that whole person, and I don't think you ever have. So how is anyone supposed to accept you if you cannot accept yourself? So she takes this and she chews on it, and then she ends up in another fight with David. He's uncomfortable with her desire to lean into her personality type. She wants to disclose her diagnosis in her dissertation. He thinks it's a bad idea, and he's now refusing to discuss it because it sounds like it's a conversation they've been having for a really long time, right? She just said it's a rehash of a fight they've been having for years. And it is, in a sense, David's rejection of her. But she believes her acceptance of herself is contingent on his acceptance of her. It's reverse order, and it always has been. It starts with her mom. Anyway, while in grad school, she is expected to complete an internship acting as a psychotherapist, and she is outraged at this. She calls it medical malpractice. She says a therapist should care about the lives of her patients. You're interested in other people's lives more than anyone I know. Captain Apathy, my ass. So Patrick is acting as a therapist. Her and David had broken up because, She believes he's rejected her. He believes she's rejected him. As she's acting as a therapist in this internship, meaning like she is counseling people but she's not getting paid, she starts to recognize sociopathic tendencies in a few of her clients. And she notices that they're all very self-aware. They're friendly, they give to charities, they're conscientious, and they're very, very afraid. And they weren't a stranger to the word sociopath. They've seen therapists before and they leave feeling helpless and alone. They're also struggling with these compulsions and they're becoming harder to control. Patrick says what they needed was someone who could empathize, a person who could listen without judgment. What they needed was help, what they needed was hope, what they needed was an advocate, and what they got was me. And there's kind of all this nonsense with Max coming back into her life, and he proposes a courtship with her. And she recognizes that she does love Max, but not in any healthy way, not in any way that was good. With him, I could just stay the way I was. I would never be judged for being bad or encouraged to evolve, but I didn't want a relationship like that. What I wanted was a true partnership. Beautiful, cooperative, challenging, addictive. It's what I wanted with David. It's all I ever wanted, period. But I couldn't have what I wanted with the man I wanted. She refuses Max's advances, and he is definitely a man baby about it. Can't handle the rejection. He freaks out, lashes out. He writes her a song about being in love with a sociopath. She's like, that's kind of silly. We've never really had a real relationship. I've had a boyfriend the entire time we've known each other. She says she has this insight that Max wasn't in love with her. He was in love with the fact that he thought she couldn't love. Not really, not normally. And that makes her safe to him, who is a famous rock star. And thrives off of validation, doesn't really want the commitment. So he doesn't love Patrick. And it's, again, a sense of false acceptance, and she walks away from it. Max says a lot of mean things to her. He does not handle the rejection well, and she kind of internalizes them and starts to self-flagellate. So wonder, I don't have any friends. The things I like to do, my reluctance to share, my aversion to affection, none of these things were relationship friendly. I loved people, I truly did, but the way I loved was different than most. I didn't need to get love in order to give love. I never had. I preferred my affections to be anonymous, independent, because she cares differently, and she's very aware of that things are not reciprocal in her friendships, in her relationships. Post-Max proposition, she ends up sleeping on the floor in an abandoned house. Then she has to go to the concert for her friend. It's her friend's kind of last concert in this area, and her dad's going to pick her up. She tells her dad that she's going to quit the music industry, and that she really loves what she's learning at school, and she really loves the counseling center, and she likens being a therapist to breaking and entering. She says the psychological equivalent of breaking and entering, except instead of wandering around people's houses, I'm wandering around people's minds. And of course, she's invited in and doesn't really touch anything without their permission. She certainly doesn't take anything, but I can understand what she's saying. Her dad says it's irresponsible for her to quit her job, and she says, I don't think so. It's irresponsible for me to stay somewhere I know is unhealthy for me. Then she confesses that Jenny has been blackmailing her, and she describes all of the things that she has done. Trips to the backyard, urges of violence, and the reason behind her reluctance to turn her in, which, is not that she thinks that the police won't do anything, but because she likes the option to seek retribution herself. She's been dealing with Jenny for a better part of a year, and he's kind of surprised by this. He says that Patrick is really brave. She's been handling this all alone. And she says it's easy to be brave when you don't care about anything. And he says, you know what else is easy, I'd imagine? Doing the wrong thing all the time, taking the path of least resistance. From where I stand, you've always taken the path of most resistance. And that's true, despite the fact that she often builds that path of most resistance herself with her own psychological mindscape. She is taking the path of most resistance. They have this heartwarming conversation, and he ends it with, hey, what if you change the content of what Jenny's blackmailing you for? What if you don't say the photos are of me? And Patrick says, you want me to lie for you? If it makes you uncomfortable, I won't ask you to do it. But I know that things don't make you uncomfortable. Plus, you'd be helping me out. And he winks. We already know that her dad is an absolute menace, for sure. So this isn't surprising to us, but it does seem to be really surprising to Patrick, and she doesn't really get to respond to this. All of these really volatile situations coming to a head at one point in time, and she's starting to feel that stuck stress, and she's having urges to act out. She describes kind of grabbing someone in front of her, screaming, the rising stress, the criminal numbness, the emotional poverty, anything to make it stop. And then she sees David. at the bar. She wants to tell him the truth, that I loved him, needed him, ached for him, and not just because he was the only person who ever truly made me feel safe, and not just because his arms felt like home, but because he was home. But she doesn't say any of that. She's trying to decide what emotion to enact. She says, this was my experience of emotion, a colorful menu of effective reactions, curated, no doubt, from a lifetime of observation. And while he's standing there, sort of waiting for some sort of reaction for her, she recognizes that it's been too long, that she hasn't decided, that she's been standing there, affectless, working through all of this. Then, she says, even more clear was his level of denial. He'd fallen under the same spell as everyone else who knew me, projecting himself onto me instead of seeing me. David was a good person, he wants me to be a good person. She thinks she weakens people, that she stains them, that she corrupts them, but she decides she's not going to do that to him anymore. Patrick usually chooses this good person thing. It's the same thing we see acted out with her sister, why she moves across the country for college, because she feels like she is emotionally corrupting her, or worries that she will. She decides in that moment that David needs more than her stillness. He needs someone for whom love wasn't just inherent, but was all-encompassing, deeply rooted in the fabric of their being. So she lets him go. She decides she's not going to be with him. They're not going to reconcile because she wants to protect him from herself. Max also happens to be at the concert venue, and he is still being an insecure little man baby, despite the fact that he is actually a rock star. He's kind of pissed. He's lashing out. He says, you used me the way that all sociopaths use people, despite the fact that Max has obviously been using her, right? Like, everyone that she is connected to has ulterior motives, but he says all these things. And then I stared at Max as the understanding of remorse crashed into my consciousness. I'm sorry, I managed to stutter. I'm sorry, I said again, and I meant it. So that's her feeling remorse. Yeah! Whether it's a product of all of these really intensely emotional things happening back to back, or, her relationship with David, the modeling she's seen in him, regardless of what it is, she has developed a sense of remorse. She feels remorse and she apologizes to someone who maybe doesn't necessarily deserve it, and that's the point. She believes that she's been coasting off the wake of other people's emotions. Later, after this really volatile event that has ended with David leaving because they didn't reconcile, Max kind of shouting at her and saying some mean things, her dad asking her to lie to the police so he's not implicated in his disgusting behavior, she goes and she parties with her rock star best friend after the show. And she says, people have never loved me. They love the darkness in me. They see the darkness and recklessness and emotional freedom, and they're attracted to it. They want it for themselves, so they take it. They use me for it, steal my ego strength, ride my wicked coattails, and I use them right back. Another example of Patrick truly believing that she doesn't have any say in what happens next. What's particularly frustrating about this is that she's born with almost every privilege in the world, and her life could be her own. If she'd been given one person, one emotionally mature, value-driven, principle-guided adult, someone who could model the behavior that she is craving throughout the entire book, someone who wasn't sleeping with her, someone who wasn't an adult man that she met when she was 14. Maybe this happens faster, maybe it goes a little bit differently, but she's developing. She says, I'm done being invisible. Why should I be the one hiding behind some fucking mask of sanity? I'm not the insane one. Those people out there, those are the insane ones, the ones who deny their darkness. I may be a sociopath, but at least I can accept it. What's interesting about this is that Patrick is so desperate to label herself, to give herself a word, to slot into something, to find a place where her existence is justified. Instead of, as a character, as a person with a narrative, with choices, with a life. First, I wanted to be good for my mom. Then I wanted to be good for David. The reality is that I need to be good for myself. Yes! I need to want to make healthy choices because I see the benefit in making them. Yes! Not because someone else is pushing me to. Yes! Yes, Patrick. I need to be who I am all the time. She needs to drop her performative masking behaviors. She needs to stop trying to understand other people's expectations of her and then meeting them. She gets it. Self-acceptance. Reclaiming her life. Love it. In the epilogue, we find out that Patrick and David have gotten married. They have kids. She has a relationship with her mom. We get kind of a conclusion with Dr. Carlin. You can't alter your behavior until you explore your unconscious. She spends the epilogue
convincing people that psychotherapy is a good idea, which it is. And she, in the exploration of the unconscious, right, this is something that takes quite a bit of time. Although effective, this traditional approach clashed with my own more slightly impatient desire for a solution. So she thinks reducing destructive behavior needs to be her first step, but you can't do that. You can't expect someone to sit 3 years of therapy while engaging with this stuck stress, this claustrophobia. People have to breathe. So she investigates CBT, she explains it, cognitive behavior therapy, her engagement with CBT and psychodynamic techniques proving extremely effective in reducing her sociopathic anxiety. She says she'd never taken the next step and investigated its origins, but she starts to unpack her experiences, and she remembers the first time she feels the pressure. It's all about the shame. The epilogue is, let's see how many pages. 30-some pages of passive-aggressively communicating messages to the reader. That therapy works, that sociopathy is not a chronic diagnosis, it's something that you can move through. I hate that people project their feelings and insecurities and judgments onto me. I don't have to accept delivery of other people's projections, and I don't have to endure fake interactions to conceal my sociopathy. Perfectly content being antisocial. Anyone who has a problem with that can go fuck themselves. Great! And honestly, that's maybe where we all should land. People are going to project their own insecurities and bullshit onto you every single day for as long as you're alive. And that's particularly worse if you're not a tall, blonde, beautiful white woman. And Patrick doesn't seem to recognize that. She doesn't acknowledge that in her book. But it's true. Everyone's dealing with this, and it's not your job to meet the expectations of other people. It's not your job to conform to other people's narratives. It's not your job to socially contort yourself into something that other people find accessible. It's your job to live your life the way you want to, by your values and your principles. It's your job to sit down and examine what those values and principles are. Like I said, I can appreciate it as a tool for people that believe themselves to be sociopathic and are looking for help and don't feel like they can ask a professional for it, and so they seek books. They follow the same steps as Patrick, and that's cool. It's cool that she's written this book. It's cool that she's accepted her truth. It's cool that she can come out about this and talk about it without the same sense of shame. If you're not a sociopath and you're reading this book, let me know down below. Did you read this book? Did you like this book? You're probably going to find it a 7 out of 10. This has been a reading of Sociopath by Patrick Gagne. This is This Page Sage. My name is Sage, and if you enjoyed this video, feel free to like it and subscribe for more bookish content. I also have a newsletter, so if you want any extra information about this channel, feel free to sign up below. Thanks so much for watching. I love books. The only thing I love more than books is talking about them. Thanks for chatting with me. Next time.